Call the meeting to order. Welcome, everybody, to the Monday, May 18th work session. Thank you to all our guests for joining us. I guess we'll do separate roll calls. We'll start with council and then move on to our other bodies here as well.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Egan?
Here.
Ms. Connolly?
Here.
Ms. Downs?
Here.
Ms. Flynn?
Here.
Mr. Schneider?
Here.
Ms. Mayor Hardy?
Here.
And I think we were anticipating possibly Ms. Underhill for virtual.
She said she'll text me when she's joining.
Okay.
So I was
we
surprised.
will-
I said, if you join, you mean.
Yes. Well, keep us posted because then we can coordinate the virtual motion as needed. For the Planning Commission, Chair Calmont?
When she joins.
Planning Commission Chair?
Here. Yes.
Mr. Duncan? Here. Ms. Freelander? Mr. Krasner? Mr. Kravinsky?
Here. Here.
Mr. Polinsky? Mr. Stevens?
Here.
And for Economic Development Authority, Mr. Bragman?
Here.
Mr. Coyle? Mr. Coyle? Ms. Kurtz? Mr. Quinn? Mr. Williams? And I believe the Housing Commission wasn't able to join.
Yeah, they send their regrets. I'm their liaison, and I think they sent a letter this evening. They're also down to 3 members, and so 2 of the 3 members sent a letter. Is that everybody?
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay. Well, thank everyone for joining us. I know there was a big meeting packet, so hopefully everyone did their homework and did lots of reading. So thank you for all that prep work. Look forward to great discussion tonight. Wyatt?
Thank you, Mayor Hardy, members of council, members of the Planning Commission, Economic Development Authority, and Housing Commission, and general public. So tonight, as we have planned for several months now, we want to discuss both the outcome of our community meetings and the direction that we've heard from community that ultimately will turn into updates to our area plans for the Virginia Village area and potentially amendments following the updates to our planning documents to zoning text to implement an updated vision for Virginia Village. And so that initiating resolution for zoning text considerations is item 1 that is before the council tonight. And then item 2 is a draft request for proposals, which we call the big RFP relative to the small RFP to get some commercial real estate advisory expertise. The big RFP is to actually go out to the market and to solicit a partner who ultimately would take ownership of the Virginia Village quadplexes that the city, in partnership with Economic Development Authority, has been acquiring since 2008 and more actively since 2000, to the extent that we now have 9 of the 20 properties in the Virginia Village area in the ownership of the Economic Development Authority. And so we'll talk about both, and we'll start off with a report from Jack Trainer on the zoning text amendments, our lead planner on this case. And let me ask our planning director, Matt Matusik, if you have any introductory comments that you'd like to make.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Just briefly, I think if you've participated or watched the joint work session between the Planning Commission and Housing Commission, you'll see some similar themes about how we are reconciling a lot of the feedback into initially more general updates to the small area plans, but also the more detailed feedback, which simultaneously is going into the request for proposals. That is going to be item number 2 on the agenda, but also being embedded into the zoning language so that we can be very clear about more recent feedback we've heard, because it is more detailed than the small area plan level of information and detail. So with that, I think Jack and Zoe are going to walk you through what that looks like. And again, a lot of the text is very similar to the last few weeks, if not months, of information we've been sharing. I think we're trying to be very transparent and walk everyone through. Some aspects are evolving, and I think when we get to the second item, we'll try to highlight what those are. But that's really based on all the feedback and conversations we've been having since March of this year. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jack.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. Good evening, Council. I'm Jack Trainer. I'm a senior planner with the city. And I'm here with my colleague,
Zoe Larive, planner with the city.
and we're both going to be handling this presentation and any questions and discussion that follows. So the item before you tonight, starting off, is a work session on an initiating resolution to initiate consideration for zoning amendments related to related small area plan proposed changes, and then also reviewing the scope of those amendments to the small area plans, which will be informing the any proposed zoning amendments that would come following an initiating resolution. So how we got here, staff has been engaging a pretty robust public engagement schedule to date. We began in March having 2 visioning sessions related to the Virginia Village area and collecting thoughts on what the existing guidance for redevelopment was in the South Washington Street and downtown small area plans, gauging how that guidance fits with current priorities for the site. And then moving into April, staff began kind of synthesizing the feedback we got and identifying buckets for where possible, kind of targeted updates to those small area plans could take place. And then into May and July, those updates to the small area plans will be going to boards and commissions and city council for consideration. While in the meantime, any proposed zoning updates would kind of follow behind. So the SAP amendments will directly inform any zoning updates that follow. But tonight would be asking for just a work session to initiate that consideration process for zoning ordinance amendments. On the next slide, this kind of shows the scope of kind of cascading influence between the comprehensive plan, small area plans, and the zoning authority. So beginning with the comprehensive plan, that's sort of the North Star for all of the city in terms of guiding development and investment. So any rezoning has to kind of point to goals stated in the comprehensive plan and show that a zoning amendment is forwarding those goals as a policy document. But the small area plans inform the approach that the goals in the comprehensive plan lay out. And so if you think about it in terms of specificity and kind of locality, the comprehensive plan is the most general in stating the goals and again, kind of blankets the city. The small area plans relate to really specific kind of neighborhood scale parts of the city and describes kind of specific strategies for implementing goals in the comprehensive plan. But then the zoning ordinance is the tool that kind of gets into numbers and is the most specific in achieving the comprehensive plan goals through the approach described in those small area plans. And so this next slide describes the existing zoning context for the Virginia Village site, which is outlined in yellow. You've seen this graphic before. The current zoning districts that regulate the Virginia Village area is RM multifamily, the B2 Central Business District, which is that pink color. RM is the brown. And then the entire site is within the mixed-use residential overlay, option 1. And so the current issue is that the zoning tools largely consider redevelopment occurring on a larger scale. You can see that the MUR overlay actually also covers the Pearson Square and tax analyst site just to the west of Virginia Village. And so these zoning tools have things like minimum lot areas and kind of prescriptive use ratios that really envision a larger kind of scale redevelopment to use these tools in order for to kind of react to the goals stated in the comprehensive plan, which envisions a mixed use area that's on the future land use map. And then also thinking of various housing typologies that could exist here. And so those are some of the issues that the current zoning presents. And so any, again, future zoning amendments would address these along with the specific feedback that will be implemented into the small area plans in terms of height and kind of more of those details on what those different housing typologies could be and what should be permitted in the zoning. And so we go to the next slide.
If I could interject with a quick question. I think the MUR was before most of our time on council. Maybe Dave, I guess, was on council. What does MUR allow
Sure.
already?
So MUR stands for mixed use residential, and there's 3 different options. It's kind of an additional overlay that introduces a mixed use redevelopment option. But the MUR ordinance similarly prescribes, I think, 2.5 acre minimum site area, which is about half the total size of Virginia Village, if not more. Would have to be contiguous site also, so you couldn't do a kind of split or scattered site. And also has, this is sort of what we're describing when we talk about really prescriptive uses. There's specific ratios to minimum commercial areas depending on how much residential you have. Things that you really do require a larger site in order to comply with the MUR. So it introduces a by right mixed use option if you can meet all the really specific requirements in it.
Threshold being kind of the minimum acreage is probably too high these days, given assemblage is always hard. I'm pulling up the zoning ordinance now. I thought it was interesting that the maximum building height in MUR is actually 75 feet tall, and that overlay has been on there 20 years, if not longer.
That's correct.
So, thank you.
In reviewing the sort of scope of the small area plan updates that will influence any zoning ordinance amendments, these again are informed by the conversation staff had with the community in the spring of this year across 4 different community meetings held at Oak Street Elementary and Columbia Baptist, as well as more targeted meetings with folks that live in the Virginia Village community now, as well as the Tinner Hill Foundation and Winter Hill community meetings. And so all that feedback we found kind of fit into these 4 buckets: building scale and density transitions, housing and affordability, open space and connectivity, and then complementary uses. And complementary uses we framed as things complementary specifically to housing. And so we'll get into some more details. If we go to the next slide. So beginning with building scale and density transitions, just quickly, and I won't spend too much time on these, there's a more specific breakdown of this table included as an attachment. The Planning Commission had a work session where these buckets were kind of broken down into more specificity, but for the sake of kind of moving this meeting along, we kind of grouped those into generally, kind of similar concerns that we heard within each section. So beginning with, height and intensity transitions that are respectful to nearby neighborhoods. So making sure that we have language addressing buffering and screening and setbacks and things that if redevelopment should happen in Virginia Village, is mindful of the folks that already live there, and takes into consideration those surrounding uses. And so, if we go to the next slide, housing and affordability. Obviously, affordable housing is the main driver here. And so we heard, obviously concern for protecting the renters that live there right now, but by maintaining existing level of affordability, not just temporarily or with a, sunset clause, but in perpetuity of any redevelopment. And then also there's a need and a want to have a diverse mix of housing typologies, including bedroom counts, and so being supportive for a variety of household sizes and kind of life stages. So we heard some desirability for, first-time homeowners, and what would that look like there? We've actually heard that a lot, across the city, across different initiatives. So it's no surprise that we're hearing this again here too, but also folks that are downsizing, and everything in between, family size, single bedroom, across the board. So introducing, some sort of zoning that would permit these type of housing typologies. And the third one's open space and connectivity. Big Chimneys Park is a huge amenity to the neighborhood. There's desire to kind of make its profile, I think, known a little bit more. And so extending wayfinding signage, directing people to the park, but also exploring opportunities for its expansion and integration into Virginia Village a little bit more. There's some angst that any redevelopment would not consider that it would take up the whole site or something. So what we heard is that Big Chimney should be a consideration for any type of zoning and redevelopment that happens here. And again, strengthening connections to the park, making sure that it's not overshadowed, that the sunlight is still able to reach it, as well as neighbors that live in the Winter Hill area. And then also ensuring that there's adequate parking on the site with any redevelopment. We heard that parking today can be a challenge for folks that live there, and so that's another important consideration. Then lastly, complementary uses. What are the uses other than affordable housing? Even though affordable housing will be the main focus, are there any other opportunities that would kind of supplant that would be beneficial to have here? And so we heard childcare, adult supportive services, different kind of civic and historical uses, particularly around the Tinner Hill area in name. And then also, if there is any kind of retail or commercial uses here, that they be smaller, kind of more neighborhood focused, and not something that's really reflective in other parts of the city, particularly in kind of larger scale redevelopment where you have kind of larger commercial bays and restaurants. And so I'll just touch again on the public engagement schedule. Going into May and July, the next couple of months, we're getting work sessions scheduled with the Planning Commission and different boards and commissions on these very considerations, being the small area plan amendments and any zoning amendments that would follow, with anticipated city council adoption of both happening in July. And so the next immediate steps would be, again, board and commission review, looking for planning commission dates in June and July, with a public hearing scheduled for July 15th tentatively, and then July 27th would be a target council date. Obviously, all future dates are subject to change, but this is what we've mapped out for right now. And so I'll end the presentation there, and Zoe and I are happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Jack. I appreciate the matrix. It's been condensed since we saw it in the Planning Commission, Housing Commission meeting. Sorry, you guys got the very dense version of it. Okay, questions or comments for staff? And we're trying to limit this to the zoning amendments and the small area plan changes, and then we'll save the RFP for the second half. Start with Planning Commission.
Thanks. Yeah, probably save a lot of the detailed stuff until we have a work session with the Planning Commission, but a couple of things I thought I would just ask for tonight. One is, seems like the possible risk of a overlay that applies to just Virginia Village could be that it's spot zoning, and I know a lot of times that kind of gets reaction. Is that something you'll address in the document to kind of make sure that people who may feel that that's a risk, that you thought about it and maybe given it some examples of why it's not? The other question. Sure, go ahead.
So we don't, so there's an overlay zone on Virginia Village now. It's not clear exactly what the zoning product might be best. It could be a new overlay on the site, but staff isn't proposing anything yet. Right now, it's just a kind of exploratory phase to see what zoning products, be it a new zoning district underlying or something like a new overlay. So we'd be doing that sort of investigative work to avoid questions like that, like spot zoning. It would, of course, go through all the kind of legal review and parameters to make sure that we're operating in the way that we need to legally.
The other question I had is, looks like you were, I was going to see if I understood this properly. Looked like you were looking at a 25-foot setback next to Winter Hill. Is that accurate under option C, I think? So the language there, I wasn't quite sure if that's, we talk about setbacks, and that's what you're actually thinking about. So that would be an increase over what's in the RM zone today.
Yeah, so, I mean, in terms of the zoning ordinance and all the numbers, there's definitely nothing like set in stone. So we'd be looking a little more closely at what the current setbacks are now. And again, in consideration with any other things we need to in terms of what the zoning will permit in terms of height and typology, setback will be subject to best address that, yeah.
I guess while we're on the comment of setback, just an idea, I think having learned from kind of where we've evolved with accessory dwellings, like thinking of setback by itself doesn't make sense, right? Because setback is always tied to the height of a building. So be able to think of the interplay of the two, I think makes sense. Like if you're only a one-story building, you probably don't need a 25-foot setback because that's the height of a shed. If you're thinking a 3-story building, then the setback might need to be different. So I don't know if that's along the lines of what you guys are thinking of.
Yeah.
Changes the zoning ordinance, making sure we have the interplay between the two versus a hard and fast number.
And I think some of that will become evident when we get into the second item for tonight, where I think we prepared some more beneficial educational graphics that kind of speak to that relationship. And I think it will highlight the theme of what you'll probably hear me discuss, which is kind of marrying of these two processes together and how the RFP actually helps the code amendments and the code amendments help the RFP. And that relationship, this two-way street, is actually possible, as opposed to one having to conclude before the second one can get going or conclude. So in the second presentation we have, we'll get into some of that.
Okay, Mary Beth? Tim, were you?
You're done, okay. So this is just a quick question related to something that Mr. Turner just said, which is, we're not quite sure where we're gonna end up here, right? There's a lot of zoning tools available, there's a lot of options. We've heard things from the community, we know what's already there. So this is gonna take a while to get through this process to come up with what the zoning actually is. My question is, and it relates to the second one too, how is it, like thinking as a developer, which I'm not, how does a developer put forth a proposal if they don't know what the zoning is gonna be? How do you envision that happening? Like, it reminds me, just, there's so much unknown. How could you put together a whole proposal without knowing what the zoning will be?
So the design criteria that are embedded in the RFP, I believe that's section 3 or 4, provide a pretty high level but pretty detailed assessment of where the code changes are going to end up. So it covers heights, setbacks, land uses. So the guts of what the code changes will be are there. If you're trying to find out what it's going to be, if you're a developer trying to find that guidance, it's there. The debate that Jack was just highlighting is simply, as we look at the current code and the various divisions and sections, we're simply just kind of playing around with what are the options available to us so that we are introducing another option for this property as opposed to trying to remove something or complicate the rest of the ordinance. So it's more of an administrative exercise with the help of our zoning administrator about changes that inform design criteria for future development or renovation or bump outs, whatever might happen. Where is their best location in the ordinance? So I think we're getting to a pretty good place on the design criteria, and they've made their way into the RFP, so everybody can follow along and the development community can help react to that. The location of where that guidance will live in the ordinance, that's what the next 2 or 3 weeks will highlight, and when we come back in June, we'll have that information.
I guess what's confusing me is you're talking about the RFP driving the strategy and the specifications for the city, including the new, private owners, the properties that the private owners are, the half that we don't own. The RFP is just for the property we own. So I'm very uncomfortable with the RFP driving the city and the zoning and the small area plans when early on at the beginning of this process, it was very clear the strategy, the small area plans came ahead of the RFP. And those feed into the RFP. Putting them in simultaneously, sure, makes sense. Doing them in parallel, I'm a strong proponent for that. But the one thing we were not on board with, and I was not on board with, was having the RFP drive the strategy. And that sounds like what is happening here, is you're putting the standards, these setbacks, these design criteria. Design criteria is a little different, but by putting them into the RFP is driving the city strategy. And that's a reverse. I'm very uncomfortable with.
So I think two-part response for that. The first one is that the RFP is not driving it the way I think framed it is holistically. I think we have 3 to 4 months of public engagement that is fed into what the RFP will be. So there's, in this 25-page document, a lot of information we collected from the community, setting up, I think what we always mention is that the community feedback will inform what our expectations, where our guardrails are for this site. So that's already in there. The testing environment of, did we get it right? That's the part that's ahead of us, where the development community, when they respond, will help test whether or not any of that is feasible. And to paint the fuller picture right now, and I'm going to keep explaining this two-way relationship. Once the RFP goes out, currently on schedule for late May, and we continue on schedule with the code changes, there is a time once we get to the first reading of those code changes that if we discover something else or they evolve enough, we can issue an addendum to the RFP to signal the new direction or whatever those tweaks may be. So this is how the code changes will continue to impact the RFP. The reverse relationship of that is once we get to late June, early July, and we get those bids back, we have not adopted the code changes at that point. If in the review of those proposals, we learn something really interesting, something creative, something we never thought of, we can simply pause the code changes, go back 1 or 2 steps, and see if we can incorporate those smart ideas we're getting free of charge from the development community into a much better code amendment. And that's by design. That's not an accident. It's a feature. It's not a bug.
And I understand that, and I'm glad to hear you say the code changes wouldn't be locked in, although the schedule in the report shows a second reading and vote in the end of July, which to me, that's when they get locked in. So, and I appreciate getting the feedback before they're locked in, but to not even have a first reading before they're public and they're set in stone in a document and sent out, I think is getting ahead of ourselves. I think the bare minimum should be a first reading so we can see, we can discuss, we can review. Today's meeting, we are not talking about the specifics of the setbacks. Should it be, the current buildings are 45 feet back from the line. I don't have a problem with 35, but 25 gets very tight. You're not necessarily going to have one story at that distance. We're getting ahead of that, the code changes too much. And I'm the one who earlier this year, when we started this, was like, yes, go parallel, do it fast, push it. But I also said, if we get farther along and we discover that we're getting ahead of it or we're not quite right, we can always adjust. And I think going parallel and having these aggressive schedules probably has us 6 to 12 months ahead of where we would have been if we had not done that. And if it takes 1 more month or 6 weeks to do it right, we're still way ahead. I'd say the whole process has been a win.
So what I would like to say to that is, one, I don't think we should fool ourselves that an additional month, 6 months is going to somehow get everybody on board. I can tell you that now, there's going to be a small group of the population that's just not going to agree with our direction. That group is voicing very different feedback than what the majority of the crowd was at a lot of our public meetings in March and April. Some have submitted letters. A lot of them are not here tonight. But I do want to kind of provide some context about what we're actually hearing and how people feel about the direction this is heading into. I think the debate we're going to have tonight does include setbacks and height restrictions, and we're going to have a lot of visuals that accomplish the same thing, even though we're speaking about one thing informing the other. So as we get into the second item, I do want people to just kind of keep an open mind in terms of, are we getting to a right place? Are we getting the type of conversation about what is the right number? And I think the visuals, in my opinion at least, quite powerful in setting that expectation.
I look forward to that. But the RFP is only for our properties, so we almost need to make sure we are covering all the properties so that after we move forward with the RFP, the other property owners know what could they do, what could they maybe take on, which direction they could go, and our zoning needs to encompass that as well. The RFP doesn't. So the zoning decisions really are greater than the RFP decisions, which is why I'm being uncomfortable without having some picture of what the full zoning is. What's in the RFP discussion is just for our properties.
Before we lose that point, I guess said a little differently. So keeping the conversation to the zoning and the small area plan, how do we craft the zoning changes in a way that gets us what we want and informs the RFP process and the two-way street that you talked about, but also for the non-city owned parcels for either a future redevelopment should they choose to sell to the city, or future should they sell to the developer if we have one, or should they just keep it permanent? Like, what are the implications for the non-city owned parcels as we think about the zoning changes?
If I were to summarize all the conversations that have been happening so far, the way that the new district would read would simply say that whatever we are creating is going to be very form-driven, and it's not going to have some of the restrictions that I think have prevented that overlay district being utilized as effectively as it could have been throughout the city. The entry into that new district to have access to what we consider to be more flexible language, but more form-driven, in capturing all the 2026 guidance we're collecting from the community, there has to be, I think, an exchange and a return to what we've heard as objectives for this site. So what the RFP and our own properties are informing in that analysis is that in exchange for affordable housing, this design flexibility, this additional tool to help you redevelop you might be eligible for. Subsequent efforts to utilize that district, once we maybe through our initial phase address the affordability issue, could be open space. So access and entry into that new district would only be through creating public parks, for example. And that could be something that we could set for those private property owners, kind of an option. You can basically, for every unit you remove from this site, you would owe us X amount of additional affordable units or X square feet of open space. Those are kind of very typical formulas that you can establish as a point of entry into a new district that is much more feasible and development friendly.
Erin?
So I'll jump in on purely the sequencing point. I'm going to ask 3 questions, and I think they're easy questions, so hopefully they're like 10-second answers, and then I can actually comment on sort of the sequencing issue. So is tonight the first time that we're all hearing about the zoning ordinance change? Like the staff report for the first time is really talking about a new zoning ordinance. We've talked about small area plan amendments, we've talked about an RFP, but this third piece of it is the first time we're talking about the zoning ordinance change.
I think in the last few meetings, what we've discussed is based on the feedback we're going to receive, we're going to assess where it belongs. And I think as it became general in nature, we highlighted where it impacts small area plans. As it became more detailed, we've indicated that's more suitable for the code or the RFP. And I think what we're showing now and have, I guess, for the last several weeks is those more detailed parameters, the guardrails, they should be in the RFP and they should be in the code language.
Okay, and then the public meetings, they were focused on the small area plan amendments and didn't cover zoning changes.
They were focused more on how do we reconcile the affordable housing priorities based on what's currently there. So in our background slides, we did cover zoning and we did cover small area plans and the comp plan. So everybody had everything in front of them. And then I think we entered into kind of broad questions.
And that made sense to me, because in looking at the small area plans, I remember very early on, right, saying, I understand the inconsistencies in the small area plans. We have small area plans that talk about a park and a community center, and we have small area plans that talk about affordable housing, and so you needed to go through a small area plan amendment process in order to make sure you had small area plans that talked primarily about affordable housing, so that if any developer came in at the end of an RFP process or anything else, they would have a small area plan that was incorporated into sort of a comp plan to be on the right track to be proposing an affordable housing development and not a park, right? Like, we needed to kind of reconcile the inconsistencies in what those, like, whatever you call them, SimCity images looked like in the old small area plans. I guess where my concern is, and I guess I'll just ask another question because I wanted to make sure that I understood this correctly. The RFPs, when they come back, the selection committee sees the proposals or the submissions, but they're not public in any sort of way, apart from whatever the selection committee puts forward as its selection. Like, are the submissions themselves going to be public?
I believe aspects of them could be FOIA-able. There may be some information that's proprietary, particularly the financial assessments and models. But we can get back to you in terms of which portions of them are public. But I think that element of it, as well as our ability to secure real estate consultants that are already working with staff, those are all the filters that help inform the code changes. So if we're having a debate about what leads what, those filters are really helpful in kind of framing the conversation and making sure that whatever does get codified and continues to live on this property. If there's a push to move those out further into July or even August, I think that's more than doable, and we have alternative plans we can highlight.
And then the zoning issues really, like, aren't a surprise. Like the RM issue, the MER issue, the, special exception issue, the affordable housing district issue. Like, I mean, we talked about this in November, right? Like, in terms of the code is going to restrict what you can do. Is the RM sort of the guardrail on this? Is the MER, do we do this through a special exception that allows 75% affordable housing component? Do you do this through affordable housing ordinance that allows density bonuses? So, like, the zoning issue, I guess I'm a little frustrated with the sequencing, because it seems there have been 3 issues that need to be resolved for this to move forward. And we've focused on 2 of them, which is the timing of the RFP because of the LIHTC housing kind of credit timeline, and the small area plan amendment issue to reconcile the, like, vision. And we always knew the zoning issues were there, but, like, now we're a week out from issuing an RFP, and we are now, like, incorporating prescribed numbers, like 25 feet and 15 feet, into an RFP without ever having a conversation about that or the zoning changes. And so to me, like, that gets to Art's concern about, is it the RFP that ultimately drives the zoning change? And is this not a, what could people come back with, and how would we want to sort of facilitate that, versus we've now told whoever is responding to this RFP in, like, pretty no uncertain terms, as I read the RFP, that we've done this to smooth your path on the small area plan amendments, and we are basically, like, en route to a zoning ordinance change that would be the parameters in which you should think about your development. And to me, that, like, is kind of out of order sequencing-wise, it's out of order process-wise, it's out of order in terms of having people have buy-in into this community. And when I think about the comments, like, I don't read the comments as people saying, I'm not, looking to help what is currently affordable housing remain affordable housing or expand into more affordable housing. I hear people talking about things that are general planning concepts, regardless of whether they ever submitted a letter or not.
Other EDA.
Yeah, just a question relative to the direction that's being proposed to be taken right now, because I too have concerns about the timing. And having spoken, I can't anymore because I'm not a developer anymore. But if I were a developer, one of the worst things you can do is give a developer a document and ask them to respond to it, and it's not clear exactly what they are responding to. And that's the sense that I've gotten from the fact that we do not have the appropriate zoning in place in order to give them a clear message of what is possible, what is not possible. The other issue or concern I've got is I heard the word spot zone come up. What other districts or property in the city would this overlay apply to? Because if it's only this specific piece of property, we have a problem. And I don't understand why we would put on the table a problematic issue for getting to an endpoint if we know that there are, gerrymandering is a bad word right now, but I kind of get a feeling about gerrymandering in terms of this particular site. We shouldn't be there. We just simply should not be there. And I can't separate this action with the RFP because I want to make a point about the RFP. My sense when we talked about, and Wyatt raised it this evening, the little RFP and the big RFP. The little RFP was associated with bringing in real estate consultants who could help us draft a big RFP. My assumption for the big RFP, and maybe I was wrong, maybe I was asleep, is that we would be looking for ideas for what could be done with this property with respect to affordable housing. When I read this RFP, and I know that's the second conversation we're going to have, this essentially gives the developer the right to develop that property. That's not where I thought we were. I don't think the community thought we were there. And I think we just need to slow down, fix the zoning issue, and then come back and deal with the RFP process. Because you can't finish zoning and you've got an RFP that's out on the street and the developers are putting together what they're going to respond to, and then you come back and tell them, oh, by the way, we're changing this. That's what gets them upset, and that's what gets them to say, I don't know, I want to deal with this kind of proposal. So if it's clear going into it, everybody understands what's going on, you don't have the kind of problems I think we are setting ourselves up for now. And I'll make the same comments for the second conversation because I think there are 3 good ideas in here, maybe, but that's all I want back. Tell me if this idea works, that idea works, or that idea works. But I'm not giving you that deal because if once I know the idea that works, then I go back to the development community and say, make your proposal on this particular proposal.
So I guess because none of us are real estate consultants, I'm kind of curious what JLL thinks about where we are with the process and this phase of the RFP and whether we think the zoning needs to be completely buttoned up or whether the design criteria that's in the RFP is enough to inform the community and get interest.
So I'll start with the second part, and then I'll come back to the last 2 or 3 points. Some of the benefit of having JLL, our real estate consultants at the table, is that they're able to make sure that of the 3 scenarios that we have, right? So full renovation, bump outs, or low scale infill development, and the more moderate infill development, that all 3, I think, have as much information available for the development community to have more adequate and comprehensive responses, or at least detailed enough where they can develop a kind of a financial model off of that. That doesn't mean everything has to be spelled out. But what we've done is kind of beefed up the renovation side by being more explicit about what the status of these units are. So if you look at that initial scenario A, kind of building by building, we went through of what our reports, phase 1 analysis, environmental and site inspections have covered. So you can see more or less what you're getting into. And as part of the RFP, we highlighted that in addition to a pre-conference meeting we'd actually meet folks on site and kind of do a site tour so you can really see in person what everything looks like. All optional, not required, but available. With respect to the infill scenarios, what JL indicated is that we should be as explicit as possible so we get very similar responses. The less detail, the more broad-ranging development proposals we can see. With that in mind, we've highlighted everything we've been hearing from the community. So those 2 pages of development guidance, or criteria, if you want to call it that, kind of walk you through the last 3 months of work and word for word capture what we've been hearing. So I think there's a lot of consistency in there. I do want to kind of push back on the premise that until we finalize the code changes, the RFP can't go out. The development community, and I've worked with a lot in different scales and different areas, they have more than enough to respond to this. That's just a fact. The only thing that tweaks to the height restrictions, tweaks to the setbacks, all they're going to do is add disclaimers that say, if this changes by a couple of feet, I may lose this money, this percentage of my units. That's all it is. Or they might put some additional disclaimer that if the height restrictions change by more than 30 feet, then we have a problem. That's all great feedback. That's actually something we want to know, because I'd hate to go through the code changes first, as a lot of you are alluding to, only to get to a product that can't be built. Wouldn't we want to know that first? This is where the free advice is coming in. And this is where we can always pause or go back 1 or 2 steps once we get to July and August and learn from the developers about how realistic are these changes that we're proposing. So if one has to lead the other, again, there's some redundancy here, but I think the RFP actually allows us to gain a lot of education to make the best code changes possible, as opposed to us pretending like we have it all figured out, getting the code changes in place, and then being surprised why nobody's building it. As has been the case with the MUR district. There's very few examples of that being utilized.
Never,
We
I
didn't
think.
get that feedback from the development community, so.
Likewise, accessory dwelling units, we debated setbacks and heights for a long time, and to date, it's been a year since we passed that ordinance, and I think we have 0 submitted and permitted. So I think getting market feedback is realistic. Now, all the comments about the right sequencing are fair, but the soundbite that I want to make sure is corrected, though, is having been to all 4 of those community sessions, I think staff actually did a really good job capturing all that feedback, and that is what is driving the proposed changes in the small area plan, potential code changes in zoning ordinance, and the RFP. I think it would be unfair to say that one is driving the other, because I think having been through all 4, and I tried to circulate the tables, I think kudos to Matt and your team, because I do think that a lot of feedback that was heard is actually really distilled and summarized accurately. So thank you for that.
And the last thing I'll just mention real quick, we're not receiving specific proposals with this process. The RFP is very specific in section 4. This is what you need to provide us with. Schematic, conceptual site layout of what do you think actually fits here. We're not looking at architecture. We're not looking at your civil engineering plans. It's a very high level of, based on what you gave me, this is what I think could work. With, I'm sure, several disclaimers we're going to see. And based on the limited information I have, here's how I think this might maybe work out financially in terms of how we're going to be able to get financing and everything else to pull this off. So there will still be a whole separate review process for a project later on, but we do need to know if there's something there. And part of what's in the RFP is they might come back and say, you need at least 3 more lots. We don't have enough here. That would be great to know, because that really does inform some of the other work we're doing.
Was there another comment from the EDA or question?
I disagree a little bit with Alan. I disagree a little bit because.
Right next to me, you know that, right?
Yeah.
Just checking.
When I look at this, I see the overlay proposal as something that's been very successful across the country. I mean, Arlington, Fairfax have multiple overlay districts. So I don't have any concern about that. I like the idea of getting feedback, because then, as you said, we would not make a mistake in what kind of a coding we would put in there. Obviously, the devil's in the details in any of this. We'll set the parameters, but then there's going to be a lot of negotiation about everything everybody's talking about. Planning Commission is going to have to do a lot of work on that. So overall, I'm in agreement with the approach, but I do appreciate Alan's input, and because he's been there. And I hope we look at what he said seriously and decide, is the process we want to continue to use? That's how I would look at it.
Can I ask a question about submissions, which is just, so is the concern, because I always looked at this RFP, like the actual RFP, and I was like, this is really bizarre. Like, why would someone spend time responding to this RFP or spend money responding to this RFP? Like, for your free advice, like, who's out there giving you free advice, right? Like, and so to me, right, like, it's not let's just see, and everyone's gonna draw things for us, and they're gonna submit it, and it's all goodwill, because we all wanna do things for affordable housing. And so it seems to me, right, that the zoning piece had to be in there in order to elicit responses, right? Like, am I misunderstanding the market, that the market just does things for free out of, like, goodwill? And, like, that the RFP, you were gonna get these,
I think it's called marketing, but it's no different than when consultants, like the ones we just partnered with, free of charge, prepare a lot of information to be in the running to help us with this process. They didn't send us an invoice for the proposal they put together, for the meeting they had with us, for the revisions, for everything else. I'm sure that costs money, but it's part of their business model where sometimes, yes, you do have to review some things free of charge to be able to get business. I actually I can't underscore how many eyes are on this particular site and the interest that's out there to be the first fully affordable project in the city. A lot of people, a lot of firms would love to have the rights to that, be able to market themselves as being the first in Falls Church. There's a high demand to be the one that gets in the door and works with us. So that, again, I don't want to underscore that, but that's already out there. We also now have 6 months worth of advertising ourselves since November, when we laid out this aggressive schedule. People are watching. There's media coverage. There's a lot of additional debates that are having. Our community meetings are elevating this. So there's a lot of people who are asking for us. I was just at a housing conference last week. I didn't have to open my mouth. People were approaching us. When are you going to issue the RFP? There's firms dedicating staff just to this one site because they're ready and have probably already started to evaluate what's possible. And I think the dividends will pay off if and when somebody actually has a chance to work with us.
so apart from the LIHTC timeline, what is the downside of sort of what Alan had talked about in terms of the RFP, like soliciting this feedback or eliciting these ideas?
Yeah.
And then saying, okay, we understand what these look like now. They give us a sense of what we might be able to do, and we're gonna perfect what the zoning is like, and then go out and kind of do this for real with, a zoning kind of code or ordinance conversation that we've had, to then select what is actually a partner, as opposed to taking the pieces and, putting them together now in the document that basically says, come back to us and we're gonna like smooth out the zoning issue for you in the meantime.
I think if you're asking about what gets paused, potentially delayed, so that the other item can get to a certain milestone, if that's the question, then I think the RFP should continue as currently planned, and the code changes maybe get pushed back by several weeks in the event, and that's a big if, right? We're all presuming that there's going to be something that's going to surprise us, but in the event that I think we feel like we need to take a step back or reevaluate some new ideas and creativity that's come in, then we have that space to do that. So we would not be finalizing the last 1 or 2 bullets in our schedule for July to finish the code changes until we've made that assessment and our consultants advise us to do that.
I guess what I'm most concerned is about we're picking you at this point in time, and we haven't had any conversation about a zoning ordinance change, or how this doesn't fit in 5 kind of pieces of our ordinance that are trying to do this thing right now and aren't working for different reasons.
Can I just maybe make a suggestion? We haven't given the staff report for the RFP, and so I think it'd be useful to do that. In terms of process, back in October when we met, we did talk about this parallel process. And the reason, as Matt has articulated, Sorry about that. The difficulty with that is you have this long lag time. You have intense public engagement over the documents, and then, several months pass, and then the community comes back in because the RFP is out there, and it may be, for feasibility purposes, we have to change what we just adopted. That's the experience that many local governments have, and I think that's an experience that Arlington has had. And so that was the argument for this parallel process. And we also anticipated back in October that when the RFP is before us is going to be the crux of the matter. That's going to be a really important time when we're kind of launching this. Do we have the document right? And so I would suggest we shift our focus to the RFP. What the opportunity is to discuss the wording of the RFP. Do we have it phrased right? And sort of focus first on that granular level, and then we can step back and say, now, having worked on it together, do we still agree that this parallel process is the right process?
I think that sounds good to me.
Well, I want to comment, the parallel process I'm totally on board with. I think even when we started it, we knew down the road there might have to be some tweaks to it. And what I'm talking about at this point, because at that early point, we didn't know how great the zoning changes would be, if there would even be any. It's that piece of it is like, I think in my mind, we've reached that point where we need to look at it and say, do we need to tweak how in parallel? And not the fact that we're just now initiating the zoning is what's really that I'm concerned with. And it really feels like the RFP is going to drive zoning versus having them work in parallel and have them work together. Because we're talking about moving on in this meeting to the RFP to talk about the zoning for the site, instead of talking about the zoning for the site as part of the zoning. That's what we're kind of doing here.
I think the thing,
And
if I could
that's-
interject, I think the thing we're getting lost by is arguing over whether we're changing zoning or small area plan or what should go in RFP, when really I think, based on the comments we're hearing, is people want to make sure that community feedback is incorporated into all of the above. Right, like that's the point, is that if we're worried about moving too fast, I think the thing that we want to make sure we keep in mind is the community feedback as well as the policy goals that we're trying to accomplish being noted in all these documents, rather than does it live in the zoning, does it live in the small area plan, does it live in the RFP? Because ultimately, that's what the past several months have been, is to make sure we did a good job hearing the community and make sure all those things were put in the right place so they can inform each other. We can continue debating whether it's the right parallel process, whether it's in zoning, or whether it's zoning right now, or doing small area plan now, or whether we're doing RFP. But ultimately, I think our job is to make sure that we are reflecting the community input and the policy objectives and what we're trying to accomplish with this project, and figure out in which document it goes in. And if we are trying to be ambitious and shoot for a timeline, what is the staff recommendation on how to get there? I think staff is laying out a process for us. I guess, Wyatt, if you think it would be helpful to move to the RFP process?
Ideally, there's language in the RFP. If there are things that people think are too prescriptive, getting ahead of zoning, okay, let's talk about those words on the page and how they could be modified. Or conversely, too vague, maybe we'll be more precise. I think that's what we'd like to be able to have the
Be
opportunity.
more productive than continuing to beat this dead horse.
Can I ask one question, not specific to the RFP, but I know when we started this process, we knew it was going to be tight, the timeline, and I know the driver was the tax credits. I believe it was March when we could submit to get some tax. Now, we talked about solar recently when we knew those tax credits are going to go away. Now, this is something that's not going to go away, right? So if we do miss it, we can reapply the following year.
That's right.
Okay, I just want to make sure that's clear, because that's different from the solar discussion we had, which is that tax
We
credit's going away.
believe that's true. There's a lot that changes in this world, but we
Okay.
believe that to be.
Yeah,
Okay,
changing
thank you.
LIHTC financing would be a massive change for things beyond solar, so.
It's not gonna happen. Quick question. There's a lot of discussion about whether zoning, small area plan changes or whatever may need to take place in order to allow for development to happen on this site. The first two scenarios under this RFP don't require any zoning change at all. So the only thing that's pushing that discussion is scenario C, which is effectively a redevelopment of a number of the properties, presumably the adjoining properties on the site. That's the whole thing that's driving this discussion.
I think scenario B also had some bump outs that would need some adjustments.
That's not zoning. If you put an addition on a building that we're talking about, that's not a major change, because you get into lot coverage areas and the like. You could add a couple of bedrooms on those units and it would not be a problem. C is the one that causes the need to have to look at a zoning change. So, if there was no zoning change made, you wouldn't be able to do this.
So I think as you'll see in our presentation, scenario B actually does trigger a lot of that because of how the site is structured, a typical quadplex. And I think part of what we're hearing about setbacks actually does conflict with bump outs, any kind of horizontal expansion we want to see. So I would say B and C are triggering the changes.
Yeah, I'd like to sit down and review that with you, because I would argue that you could get away with doing additions to those buildings and not have to go through a zoning change.
Let's jump into the RFP then. Sounds like people are ready for that.
All right. So if we can go to slide 2, there we go. Helpful reminder in terms of why we're doing this in the first place. And I think it is helpful to reorient ourselves to where portions of the property are in our control and that we're really focusing the RFP guidance and requirements to. And also highlight how the real estate consultants are helping us with this process. They're on board. They've provided a lot of helpful feedback as we met with them and rewrote the second version of the RFP. So diving right in, if you go 2 slides later, the document itself has approximately 6 sections. The latter ones are really governed by purchasing rules, so we're not going to speak too much to that. The first 2 are really just factual background information, so kind of where are we, what's our housing situation like. It's really 3 and 4 that I wanted to focus on, and I think we're going to continue to have a healthy debate about. And that is, what are we requiring of the site? What are the expectations? What have we heard from the community that has been directly embedded into this document? And then once we receive that information, how are we going to prioritize? How are we going to assign points? What does the evaluation process look like? So this is where I think the benefit of these type of conversations, including the one we had a couple of weeks ago with the Planning and Housing Commission, is really helpful. So if we go to the next slide, focusing on that first section, we alluded to the fact that there are 3 scenarios. And the way we're highlighting them are, scenario 1 is if somebody were to purely do renovation and rehab to the existing structures. We've had the benefit of incorporating a lot of analysis from reports and inspections. So I think building by building, you can kind of see what you might be getting into. And we hope that that level of detail will help have more prescriptive and detailed proposals and financial evaluations associated with them. Scenario B is a evolution of what I think we originally had. We've gotten some feedback in that, could this second scenario represent bump outs, perhaps a 3rd floor added if we wanted to increase bedroom sizes, if we wanted to add additional floor here and there. But could maybe some of those units be demolished in place for low-scale infill development? So this will be a kind of a distinguishing factor between the final scenario, which is more moderate infill. But I think we wanted to kind of highlight that the scale of what we're trying to achieve with scenario B is similar, depending on whether you renovate and do bump outs or just simply redevelop, but at a smaller scale. The RFP also has options for hybrid responses. So if folks really get creative and see an opportunity based on what we own, they could kind of pick and choose. They could also come back and say none of those really work. There's just no way to finance it. So either we continue to be patient, acquire additional lots, or proceed in a very different direction. We have a lot of language throughout the RFP that encourages that. So that table you see on the bottom kind of gives you a sense of kind of a apples-to-apples comparison across those 3 scenarios. I know there's been a lot of discussion about heights and how many units we might yield. We have reduced the minimum unit expectation in scenario C because even though it's lower than the kind of a sweet spot for financing that we've heard, which is generally around 120 units, I think setting a lower minimum does open up creativity. And I think what we're hearing is that it might provide more options for us to consider. So that's something that we're factoring into the code changes where we talked about for every unit potentially removed from the site, maybe 2.5 to 3, maybe it's 5. What is that ratio like to make sure that we are growing affordability on this property? All right, next slide gets into the selection process. We kept talking about a selection committee over the last few meetings. Currently where we are is looking at a 5-person roster, if you will, kind of having a citywide representation between the various commissions, the EDA, obviously city council, and staff to work with our real estate consultants and kind of be as prepared as possible for the bids that might come in, review and make recommendations about who might be the top bidder in that process. And then finally, the criteria for evaluation. The latter parts of the RFP discuss, based on everything we've asked for and what we're hearing that the community wants to see here, here's how we are prioritizing the creativity that the development community might bring to this. The two biggest buckets, if you will, are the program concept, obviously. What range of units, what housing typologies, how creative can someone interpret what's currently on the site, but then also the budget and financing, where we've broken it down into not just how feasible your proposal might be, but how are you helping minimize our subsidy moving forward into this project, particularly with respect to gap financing. There are some other categories that, looking at other RFP documents and surrounding jurisdictions, I think we found very helpful, and our consultant agreed would really make for a better process. So you'll see those there, obviously qualifications and kind of the schedule that developers are proposing when it comes to financing and construction. Moving on to the next series of slides. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on each one of these because this really gets into the meat of the first issue, which is what's really feasible here. We wanted to highlight what a typical quadplex looks like on this property. Most of them are about 70 feet wide, 110 feet long. When you look at the typical lot, you can see there in the white font the various side, front, and rear setbacks. And then most of the buildings themselves are about 40 by 40 feet. So this is kind of the starting point. And what we wanted to highlight is that if we're looking at scenario B, and this was a lot of feedback we collected from the community, that if we don't do larger infill, perhaps bump outs could help us get to some of these goals. We're already at 15 feet on the side, so bump outs are just not feasible in that direction. The front yard is 30 feet. We might be able to get another 5 feet, maybe 10 into that area, but pretty quickly we're going to start making these non-conforming. So the real opportunity, the really only opportunity that we see in terms of a horizontal expansion is into the rear. So if we are serious about making sure we are getting proposals that address bump outs and focus more on the lower scale development, we have to be able to have a conversation about the rear setback of 40 feet. Maintaining that or increasing it, as we've heard from some, is just not realistic for either scenario B or scenario C. So this is a really interesting starting point I wanted to highlight. There's a few others I want to also point to in the next few slides, but this really sets the stage for the rest of the conversation. So if we go in the next slide, the focus here is how are we looking at those impacts? So we started to look at the numbers. The staff report and the RFP have specific setback dimensions and height restrictions. Let's look at the southern end, which is the focus area 1, closer to the tax analyst building, and the northern end, closer to Big Chimneys, which is focus area 2. And what would a cross-section look like if we were to compare what's there today and what the RFP is currently recommending in terms of height and setback guidance? So these are the two areas we're going to go through for the next 3 or 4 slides, but I wanted to introduce what that looks like now that we know what a typical quadplex property is providing. So in the next slide, we highlight really the topography changes that occur between the two properties of Virginia Village and Winter Hill. And this is a very delicate and critical aspect because they are not level. So when we look at a 2-story option on one site, it is not 2 stories on the other. If you walk the site, and staff has several times, we've been there with our urban designers, with our arborists, we've taken an inventory of the trees. There's a lot of vegetation that needs to be replaced, but there aren't any critical root zones along that edge that require a significant setback. That is what consideration that we've applied to here. What you will see and this is really true for that entire edge, is that what is typically a first floor of a typical Winter Hill condominium is actually the second floor of the Virginia Village quadplex. That's how the grade works. There's approximately 4 to 5 feet of elevation change on the Virginia Village side. So if you look at the image on the right, there's a small hill that most of the lots have before a privacy fence gets introduced. And then you can see just above the privacy fence, the entry doors into those Winter Hill units and the top 2 floors above that. So the point we're trying to make with this slide is just in the existing conditions, what we're really modeling Virginia Village for are 3-story structures that are currently in Winter Hill. Even though they're technically 2, their elevation treats them as 3. And that's an important existing condition that we need to be mindful of. So with that in mind, if you look at the next slide, what we tried to do is look at all the feedback we received, and the sensitivity that obviously was highlighted was along Winter Hill and Big Chimneys. So the red line that you see edging the property is where those sensitive setbacks and height restrictions have been applied. What we've also heard is that the other edges, Bowl America, Tax Analyst, and Maple Avenue, don't have those same issues. So we can be a little bit more fluid and flexible as it relates to those setbacks and height restrictions. So when you see the RFP and those numbers jump out to you, that was the approach we took. And again, both numbers can continue to evolve based on feedback we receive, but this is why you see 2 different sets of numbers. We're not treating the whole site with the same condition. And the final 2 slides on this topic deal with the existing condition and then what our RFP guidance, which is modeling the code changes, what that would do. So focus area 1 is the southern end of the property. So now we are, I'm sorry, this is actually on the northern end, closer to Big Chimneys. With the elevation changes we just highlighted, okay, you can see on the upper right what the current conditions look like, where Winter Hill basically is an extra story above Virginia Village. In our proposal, we would not only cap heights at 3 stories as we get towards that 25-foot setback from the lot line, but then make sure that if any additional floors are added, they are pushed back and recessed so that we achieve a 45-degree angle. This will allow light and air to reach the zone of setbacks and the adjacent properties. This is a pretty common approach to not just prescribing height limits and setbacks, but making sure as people consider creativity in a development program, they recognize that upper floors have additional guidance as well. And again, if the feedback is we need to tweak some of those, if something has to be pushed back or the angle has to be adjusted, we're happy to have that conversation. That's why we're here. But I think we do need to start with something, and based on the current conditions, we felt that this was something appropriate. And I'm happy to get feedback on that. The second focus area has a slightly different situation because here, instead of having the Winter Hill buildings closer to the property line, they're actually 20 feet away from that fence. So the combined effect is really 45 feet between the 2 buildings. So that same approach of a 3-story restriction, 45-degree angle for any bulk plane before upper stories begin, gives you an even greater separation and access for light and air to reach the adjacent properties. So this is kind of the level of graphics we're still working through and kind of utilizing to inform the guidance that we've heard, because to really ensure we have properly vegetated setbacks and incorporating for topography changes between the 2 sites, we felt like this was actually appropriate. And if the debate allows us to evolve that even further, we can come back next week with slightly modified numbers, but we believe this is a great starting point. And then the last thing I'll mention is the process, which, looking backwards, does engage a significant amount of stakeholder groups. We've been very heavy with the staff team, both in housing and planning, to work closely with the current residents. We actually have a 3rd meeting just for them coming up in early June. We've also met with the Winter Hill community several times. The Tinner Hill Foundation continues to have regular updates, and we continue to communicate. In addition to the web presence we've had, the flyers, and additional notifications, including the focus. So the last 2 slides in this presentation kind of get us to the planning scenario. So I've tried to break this slide up into 2, where we look at where are we now, what additional meetings are in front of us. Per tonight's conversation, this is still fluid. And again, things that might happen on the RFP site might inform the schedule. But if you go to the next slide, we bring in the RFP and kind of signal how in late May, we like to get to a point where we issue it, and then in late August, be able to receive and recommend a top development team. So I believe that should be everything unless we have one more. Is that it? All right. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really helpful to understand kind of the thought that went behind the setbacks, especially not just the relationship as we were talking about between height and setback, but also current topography and how that feels in the current conditions. So thank you for sharing that. Questions or comments on the RFP? I'm going to ask the Planning Commission because you guys have been quiet since Tim. Do you all have any further comments or questions?
Maybe you could talk a little bit about option A and why we are including it in the RFP, the sort of rehabilitation only, no additional units. What's the value of having it in there?
I think it's representative of feedback we've heard at various conversations, both community and here, where we don't want to just make the leap that development is the only solution here. And understanding or having greater clarity about how much money would it take to just renovate and preserve what's there today. So if we have control over half the site, so 10 buildings, that's 40 units, how much would it take overall to renovate those buildings just to preserve 40 units, right? So kind of like a dollar figure per unit, if you will. And of that dollar figure, how much of it is coming from us versus maybe other sources? A process that I think is going to highlight the limited venue of how many funding streams are available for those type of efforts, as opposed to perhaps infill development. But I think to allow everyone, not just the transparency, but to also come along for this conversation, we do need to ask that question because maybe we're missing something. Maybe there is a magical solution and maybe preserving what's there today, even if it only gets us 40 units right back, is maybe the best we can hope for. Part of that, I think, informs the other end of the spectrum, which is scenario C, that if we're not ready for that level of development, because maybe we need to consolidate and get additional lots, what do we do in the meantime? Because it may be another 5, 10, 20 years before any one of the remaining property owners is willing to sell to us. We've had conversations over the winter. I think this is it for now. So if we are currently property owners, and a lot of these units, as we've now made it clear, require a lot of investment, a lot of renovation, who's going to pay for that? And that's a question I think we all need to have a better grasp on once we come out of the summer.
So what we're hoping to get from this for option A is ideas from the development community about funding streams that we could have to complete those renovations. I mean, do we know the dollar amount for what those renovations might cost if we've done that kind of analysis? I mean, you have a good inventory here of what the needs are, but I guess why are we going to the development community for that information? Is it because we think that they can also tell us what funding streams we might be able to tap to complete that, or that they don't exist?
I mean, so far, I think we've made strategic and surgical investments in terms of replacing a roof, some appliances, some kind of critical elements. Every month, additional ones come up. These are 80-plus-year-old units, so we're going to get surprised every year, every month. So the costs are kind of already embedded into the process as we speak. But part of what I think we really need to hear, maybe perhaps the tiebreaker, is having the development community kind of help us all clarify between these three options, what's really realistic and what is kind of fiscally responsible of a city in terms of the return on that investment. So if they come back and tell us infill development is preferred because it's just hard to justify expanding so much resource and money into just receiving the same amount of units, and during the process, kind of having folks live somewhere else, because this construction is not something you can live through. Is that something we really should be pursuing? And I think there's a lot of question marks about, now that these are ours, what do we do? So I think we wanted to pose the question, however unlikely that outcome might be, just to kind of get a clarification and confirmation.
Okay. We may agree to disagree on the value of proposing the question to the development community, but that's fine. I trust your professional judgment. I want to ask about scenario B, because you said earlier that the advice you got from the development community is to be very explicit, so you get similar proposals. But now it sounds like scenario B is kind of a pretty broad range of potential things that could happen, including renovation with a bump out, renovation with additional story, or maybe we're taking down some of the structures and putting in like a 2 to 3 to 4 story. I mean, that's like a pretty wide range of potential outcomes. So are you concerned that now scenario B is a little bit mushy because it's sort of like a wider range? Or do you think it still kind of meets the best practice that the development community advised you on?
I think it falls more cleanly in the scale of change, which I think was a common theme. I think a theme everybody can really relate to. Status quo, interior finishes, nobody's going to notice. 3 to 4 story, 2 to 4 story scale of development, either through bump outs or minor infill, or something that's closer to 3 to 7 stories. In that, I think part of the challenge is that we don't want to end up with too many scenarios.
That was my
and that
next
has
question.
consequences to
Is
that
there
as
a
well.
reason that 3 is the best practice
Right.
number of scenarios?
The thing I will probably remind everybody, because this will apply to a lot of questions, is that if you look at the schedule that's in the RFP, there is a question deadline. So folks, when they receive this, they have 2 weeks to think it over. They can send us questions. We'll be very responsive. We will have a pre-conference meeting, additional opportunity to clarify if we're vague or confusing, conflicting, and we can issue an addendum. So that's 3 different opportunities to clarify based on the reactions we get. And I think a lot of times it's very difficult to see how this is going to be received, but I think our consultants are helping us with that.
Thank you. First, let me just add on to what Andrea was talking about with the scenario B. First of all, thanks for changing the scenario based on our feedback from the Planning Commission. It looks like you added some of, you modified scenario B to include low-rise residential development, which is good. It gives the community some options. But it does seem as though for the scenario B, it is a little muddled. It might be cleaner to take the preservation that includes bump outs and add B1, which is full renovation plus bump outs, to the first scenario. And that way you have essentially 3 separate scenarios. You have a preservation scenario, you have a demolition and low-rise residential development scenario, and then you have a demolition and higher development scenario. It gives you essentially 3 things to look at. It just seems like right now, B has a lot of different options, from tearing things down to, bumping out the existing quads and stuff like that. I just think you'd be a little cleaner if you structured it preservation that includes bump outs, demolition and low-rise development, 3 to 4 stories, and then the more aggressive infill in the higher density. It's just a suggestion. And the other comment that I wanted to make was, I'm a little concerned that when you get into the source selection, the selection committee, that's all very close hold. So what happens, how do you get that community feedback? What if one proposal comes in as preservation and one proposal comes in as high-rise development? How do you make that source selection without that community feedback? Obviously, once you're in the selection process, you're pretty close hold. I guess there's some foiable pieces to it, but you can't necessarily talk to the community about, but somebody's going to make a decision that we want low-rise development, high-rise development, preservation based on the proposals that you get. And you're going to do that without community feedback, it seems. Is that correct?
So part of what you're describing, and back to your first point, if I combine the two, it might actually be easier just to extract what I think you called B1 into its fourth scenario, rather than, I think, complicating the renovation side, because I think a lot of feedback we've heard is to have a very clean renovation scenario. So I would be going backwards on a commitment we made to that group. So I think the cleanest way to address, I think, those last two comments is to extract the 3 to 4 story infill scenario and make its own. I think we're still in single digits, so it's okay. The larger point, though, RFP selection has, first of all, purchasing rules. So selection committees, once they're established, yeah, it is kind of like a closed door situation. What I would argue is that the representation that's on that roster, I think, is representative. So I think we were very mindful of who we are inviting or having a conversation with. But the selection criteria, there's like 3 pages of this in the document that speak to what's really important to us, how will we prioritize, how will we assign points. So that's all spelled out for, and that's really something where currently anybody can weigh in on. And I think that guidance on how we will evaluate proposals is how I view the public feedback informing the process, as opposed to every single resident being at the table on every single decision, because that's not feasible.
No, I appreciate that. I just think you have, assuming the preservation is perhaps a throwaway, it may or may not be a viable option. Then you have essentially low-rise development, which might have a lot of community support and or more high-rise development. And somewhere along the way, you're going to have community feedback to say which of those two options is the most important for you, or is the best option.
So I think expanding it, so instead of 3 scenarios, we have 4, tackles some of that. We also have a clause in there where hybrid options are also encouraged. So it's really a kind of a full menu. We're not being really restrictive, and we want creativity. Again, I think there needs to be some level of trust in the selection committee to do their job, but we're basically spelling out their instructions for us in this document. So the point assignments, if we need to reconfigure that, if there's a separate category we feel is missing that we need to add so that we are expressing what their evaluation should be, that's something that I think we still have time to do, and staff is willing to kind of take that feedback.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a question about the scenario C and the selection of 100 units as a minimum. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that as to how you got to that number of 100. And does that drive any particular renovation in your mind as far as the typology of renovation that might occur with that number?
Part of what I think is interesting in that we don't have, half the entire property consolidated. So we have control over the 2 ends. And that could be a limitation, but it's also an opportunity for creativity. As I look at the site, as others have so far, I think one edge of the site could help the other. And I think creative teams will have a way to make sure that we are fully utilizing what's currently available to us. As it relates to the 100-unit count, the feedback we've gotten, and I think we've been very clear about this in our conversations this past winter when we've sat down with several development teams. I think in our January staff report, I think we've expressed a lot of the feedback we received. Almost everyone that deals with low-income housing tax credits highlights that there is a sweet spot where if you don't have enough units, you're just not competitive enough. Other projects will win out that year. If you have too many, that also becomes a problem, in addition to parking and everything else. So this kind of a sweet spot that continues to be the range we want to target is something we're keeping an eye on, but we don't want to be too prescriptive where if we set too high of a minimum and somebody with all the restrictions and guardrails we're putting on this site is not able to meet it, then we have another problem. So I think lowering that was a strategic move because of the height restrictions and the setbacks, which are eating further and further into the site, and therefore, based on what's left, how much can you actually fit? But that's kind of the question ahead of us is, can you actually get to 100? Maybe they can.
I think Phil on the Planning Commission, looks like you have, trying to get to everyone who has not spoken.
Sticking with that number discussion, the 120 number that you cited earlier is one of the sweet spots for financeability. Is it possible to design a scenario that uses essentially the ends of the property, the city-owned buildings to the north and to the other side by the bowling alley and overlooking tax analysts, to create height and density and numbers that get you above 100, maybe 120, while preserving a central core of current owners who can decide to do at some point in the future what they want to do. Is that a scenario that the market could nibble at? I mean, I'm personally not charmed with that. I would like to see us aim for a number closer to the number of affordable units that we're, going to be losing in the next 4 to 5 years, and I think that number is about 160. I would trade density and height for 160 units if I had the whole site, and increase the setbacks around the edges of the property by having 5 stories on Maple, stepping down to 4 to, I think, where you were in your graphic representations. At any rate, are either or both of those scenarios still in play based on what you are proposing that we put out to the development community?
I think, as I understood your question and comment, they are part of what, and I understand there were some comments that came in the last few days. To make sure we have full flexibility, we are prescribing the form that we believe needs to be respected on this site by accounting for setbacks, not just from Winter Hill, but big chimneys. So I think if you go back to kind of the red boundary, the delicate edge conditions, that's driving and depressing the buildable area because the buildings do need to step down. Based on the relationship of Virginia Village to Winter Hill, to big chimneys, southern exposure, we do have to factor that in. And I think inevitably, to do it right, which is the objective here, that is going to lower the unit counts. So I think going above a certain floor count is just simply not realistic. Plus, even if you did, you're probably right on the edge of concrete construction versus wood frame. That's going to have its own challenges. What we thought was really important, there's 1 or 2 bullets in the RFP that stipulate this, is to be very creative with our own right-of-way. The right-of-way is what separates some of the lots that we currently assembled. Maybe there's some creativity and opportunities in that, particularly since we have access to both ends of the property. So I think within that, and given the heights that we have, we should have a path to get to 100 units, hopefully more, on the scenario that's number 3. The second one, what might become number 4, that's more of a question mark because that middle housing typology, is it a townhouse, is it a garden apartment, what does that look like? And again, the economics of tearing down a quadplex with 4 units just to bring back something very similar, you don't have to be a developer to understand that that's not really the best course of action. But.
And when you say 100 units, right now we have 80 units there, they're all 1-bedrooms. Would your 100-unit building include a mix of bedroom types, 1, 2, and perhaps even 3?
So this is where, we keep using the 40 number because we only have access to half the site. And the remaining half, the central portion, could stay the way it is for decades to come. So we are not anticipating change happening there, although at some point when we codify the changes, opportunities for either affordable housing or open space could be embedded in that. As it relates to the ratio that we are generating right now, if you look at 40 units on the city-controlled portions, and us being able to potentially achieve 100 units, that's a factor of 2.5. And that's closer to what most developers will tell you. If I'm going to remove something, I need to come back with 3 times as much density for it to actually pencil out. Those are just facts. That's not even an opinion. So let's use that, right? If we know, and this hasn't changed, if anything, it maybe gone up. Maybe it's 4 or 5 now, given the market conditions. But it usually was, you got to give me at least 3 times more if I'm going to take down a building. So what does that look like for this piece if we're going to be only impacting what we have access to? We can't control what happens on the inside of the property.
Do you think that they would present options for multi-bedroom units, or would they see it as, you know, basically what it is now, which is 1-bedroom apartments?
It'll be challenging, but more achievable with scenario C, the larger infill structure, because if you look at the current quadplexes as they are structured today, and you simply try to reintroduce a similar scale of development, but suddenly, instead of just replacing 1-bedrooms with 1-bedrooms, we've asking you for more 2-bedrooms or 3-bedrooms, you're gonna lose unit counts because you have larger units. So now we're going backwards. If we're achieving one goal, we're sacrificing another. So that is another factor we have to consider, and the evaluation criteria, I think, gets us there. Which of these helps us get to the larger citywide objective for affordability? And it includes both the unit count, but also the bedroom sizes and the AMI levels.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anyone else who has not spoken yet before I go back around for a second round? Mary Beth, Dave, Laura. Dave?
I don't want to preclude anything, though, that our boards and commissions wanted to say. I do have some comments, but let me reserve that. Alan, was there something you wanted to say? No. No, I had just a question, quick question. JLL is your little RFP consultant. Did they run pro formas for you guys?
Part of what their next phase, while the RFP is issued, is they'll be conducting very similar exercises of what if they were the developer, what in their opinion would make the most sense. So the 5 to 6 weeks we are giving everyone else, they're going to be busy using that time to create a baseline for the evaluation committee to look and utilize once the bids come back. So they've helped us review, and they're going to continue to help us refine the RFP. And then for the month of June, July, they'll be conducting that analysis for the various scenarios. And with that at hand, we'll be in a very good position to review the bids that come back in July.
So did they, were their recommendations behind these scenarios?
Correct.
And they didn't provide any performers with these recommendations on these scenarios?
Part of that is they're waiting for the developers to give that to us.
That,
So before I go back to Dave, I think for council, we have a letter from the chair and vice chair of the Housing Commission. Given that they couldn't be here, they want to make sure we point out the affordable living policy goals. And so to Phil's questions about kind of unit sizes and bedroom counts and AMI levels, they were reminding us what we adopted in our 2025 affordable living policy and the commitments we made. So I'd ask that council go back to that letter that we got this evening. And thank the Housing Commission for joining you all in work session before. Dave, did you have other things now?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Madam Mayor. And I would just also second the importance of reviewing the letter from the Village Preservation and Improvement Society. And we've all received, I think, 30 or 40 emails just in the last 2 days on this project. And there's been some useful clarification tonight, but I'm really concerned about starting down a road on a project like this that could potentially cost $10 million or more of taxpayer money without the kind of consensus that I think we really need to have. And so I think the sequence here is relevant and entirely important. And I think the details of the RFP are also important. So the first is the 100 affordable units really drives toward option 3, and I'm concerned about that drive. The second issue I have is this 20-foot building free zone along the Winter Hill area. If we're going to go 3 stories or more, I think we need to preserve the 40-foot and not reduce to the 25-foot. It's a whole other matter if we go with option A, and those remain 2-story buildings, then I think you can look at that potentially. The next issue I have is the site transition. I don't think we're clear enough in that we're expecting significant transition as it gets close to Winter Hill as opposed to the bowling alley area. And I've read this and I don't see it listed there enough. One notable absence is the failure to have a shadow study, which I think will truly help inform what people are actually going to be living with and where they're going to be living with it after this, whether it be in the park or whether it be near Winter Hill. And open space issues remain less than specific. I want to talk generally. The term RFP, at least in my experience, is a bit premature here. I think, Planning Director, you referred to it as just a way to get information. If that were it, then it would be a request for information. And this is not just linguistics. This is clearly setting down the road to a decision, including a selection committee, that I think this isn't quite ready for prime time, either the zoning issue or the RFP. We've had now 2 hours of very fruitful discussion. And believe me, I want a project to go forward. I want affordable housing to be maintained there at the very minimum, made more livable. And then if we can get more units and we can fit into the needs of the existing tenants and the surrounding area, then it becomes a win-win for everybody. But right now, there is not the view in community that this is a win-win. There's a view in the community that this is a win-lose, and that's not a good way to start a major project. We were very careful, for example, in the school project to lay things out very carefully, and then we did a referendum. I don't know at this point whether this qualifies for that, but we were very careful. The first thing we did was look at all the options, and the RFP does make an effort to do that. But we received a lot of community input that I don't think is so far adequately addressed here or explained, although I think the explanations tonight were extremely helpful in moving in that direction. But our community has not seen that. Our community has not seen a lot of the information or heard a lot of the information that we're getting tonight. And to then expect that we're going to take final action on this, having received very, very strong comments on both sides of the issue, but especially on the negative side, raising these issues. That's fundamentally important to me. And finally, this is one of the areas of the most affordable housing we have in the city, not only Virginia Village and Winter Hill. And we have to be very careful that we do not degrade the current living and situation for those who live here now, in the hopes of adding more for people that don't live here. So I'm out for a win-win. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we've made some major progress, and I think with some of the changes that I've suggested, we can maybe get there. But I do urge more community discussion so that they can hear what we've discussed tonight, they can deliberate on it, and hopefully some of the questions that have been raised and some of the negative comments we've got can be responded to. But right now, we're facing a divided community, which is a really bad idea to move forward on a project like that. That's just my best advice. And I am committed to trying to make something work. Also, though, the comments of the people that live there were particularly clear. One of the commenters said, you know, there's all this talk about missing middle. We are the missing middle in the city of Falls Church. We are the people who live there. So if we go with a major development, some development will require some movement, some short-term movement. But if you're talking about a major building, you're talking about 2 years. You're going to be moving people out, having them live someplace else, with the public responsible for the delta, and then moving back. If you did more of a rehab, yes, it would take weeks or months, if you will, but it's a different kind of disruption. So that's, in listening to the debate tonight, and I've tried to be very careful to listen to it, I think there's questions about sequence that aren't resolved yet. And I think there are some elements of the detail that I've heard some good things about, but I think some questions remain. Anyway, that's my view. I don't think this is quite yet ready for prime time with the kind of action that is potentially being asked of us and our community next week. Thanks.
Other comments or input for staff?
It definitely reminds me of our high school project, where we didn't know, we had so many options, we went through all these different iterations, we had unsolicited bids, right? We went through this whole process to try to figure out what we were going to end up with, and it took a ton of community engagement, a ton of thinking and rethinking, and we did an RFP, we did a feasibility study, and that was one that wasn't even in our plan, but we had our interim superintendent who was here, do you remember? And he was like, why aren't you people doing a feasibility study? What's wrong with you? And so we popped that in, and that really turned the tide because people could see what was feasible and what wasn't. I don't know if that was something that was considered here, feasibility study, but that could be something that helps us all feel a little more comfortable with that. I don't know if you want to respond to that. I have a couple other questions.
I think the broader message is that that's what the RFP is for. And I know we're just going to agree to disagree on that. But the feasibility analysis that has been conducted on this site to date, and there's been several, conveniently assumed that we would have access to the entire site. And that's just never going to happen.
Right.
So we are asking some fresh questions that haven't been posed yet. And quite honestly, it's not going to be college students that are going to solve this for us. It's just not going to happen. It's a helpful collaboration at times. It helps them out a little bit. Every now and then we get some fresh ideas, but that's not how we solve this. We do need the development community to weigh in on this. I don't think it's also too aggressive in that we are simply, through this next process, highlighting who we think is creative enough, has the experience, and thinks there's a financial way to make this work. They would still have additional steps, many of them, after this process. We're simply picking who would we want to work with, given their portfolio, given their approach to this site, and their experience solving challenging sites like this in the past. So I want to keep highlighting that additional steps are in front of us. Whether you look back, however many years we've been working on this, whether you look ahead, there's so much engagement that has happened. And simply adding a few extra months is not going to get to the fact that some people just don't want to have change happen here.
You know, I want
That's just reality.
Yeah, I don't think that's the scenario.
That denigrates our citizens.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
But I
Use
think
that
open
argument.
space, I
Mayor?
think what I'm trying to say is open space preferences
Yeah.
for this site, which have been expressed in other documents.
Right, right.
Could I ask
Continue to be expressed in terms of what people would prefer. And that would be much softer transition to that edge. Introducing housing contrary to that opinion. So we're fighting kind of the two opposing views of what the site could accommodate. And if you look back at the two small area plans, there's a push and pull on that quite frequently. So we are now at a point where we need to pick one. And the fact that we've become part owners of half the property gives us a very different perspective on that.
To give people some comfort on both the speed as well as the sequencing, could you talk more, or Wyatt, talk more about the process? Let's say we do get responses, then there's a selection committee that chooses one, and then what? Like, we still have to enter a comprehensive agreement, there's still talk more about that process.
Yeah, so they, the selection process would be accompanied with an interim agreement that would sort of lay out a term sheet of what the business arrangement would be with the entity, and then also the number of units, and other criteria like that. But then from there, you go through a site plan process and all the steps that go to a final closing, which includes getting financing. So there would be steps post-selection still where there's, really important decisions still to be made. I might back up just, on the parallel to the West Falls, the feasibility study was really focused on the school. Like what do the school requirements have to be, and where do we want the school to be? And once that was clarified with the feasibility study, then kind of that's what allowed everything to go. The city was quite open about what the zoning ultimately was going to be, what the rules were going to be for the 10-acre site. In the RFP, it basically said, up to 15 stories, and didn't provide much more than that. It did provide guidance on uses, but not so much on height and density and things like that, so that the market could come in and sort of inform what ultimately that would be.
Right. So,
One more just follow-up. Are we obligated to pick one if we don't like any of them?
No. When you issue the RFP, there is, you preserve your rights not to select anyone.
yeah.
Madam Mayor, if I might, this has been described.
Well, Mary Beth was in the
I'm
middle
sorry,
of
Mary
it.
Beth.
No, go ahead.
This RFP is then described in two different ways. Oh, it's just a request for information. It's really much more than that. You have a selection committee. You're going to pick one. There's going to be intense pressure to go with that one. And that's what I say about the confusion of process here. If you wanted to get information, there are lots of ways you could put out an RFI. And this is not just linguistic. You're literally saying to people. But here, you're saying, you're being pretty precise about a number of the details, not precise about others, which creates issues. And then you're creating a selection committee. That reads like this is the final stage of the process rather than an information gathering process.
So we are trying to get proposals. We are not obligated to pick any of the proposals. And then if we do pick a proposal, we then enter further negotiations with developers. So I'm hearing actually that we are getting information, we're getting feedback from the market. We have a choice not to pick any of them if none of them meet our expectations or they're too expensive or whatever the issue may be. And then there's further negotiations.
I feel like what I'm hearing are some expectations of what we're going to get back or what the developers are thinking that I feel are unrealistic. That when this goes out there, you're looking for the developer to come back with some feasibility, some concepts, some soft stuff, and they're going to be coming back with their starting point for the full proposal. We'll pick who we want to move forward to. It might even be two, to say, okay, tell us more, show us more. It is the first step. If it's an RFP, it is the first step to them. It is the first step in a big business deal. And we need to make sure that what's in here is enough for them to take that first step, not to give us some feasibility. And I had actually written down feasibility study before Mary Beth even mentioned it, because that's what I was hearing, expectations. But this is the first step in, to them, a big business deal. And the information in the RFP, it's getting there. It's on the right track. It's not there yet. I mean, some basic stuff is missing, such as the zoning. What are the rules around combining properties? If you show the slide with the buffers around a single building, you're talking about currently 15 feet on each side of each building within the property. Even option B, can they combine two of those? And you can see another building right to the right there. There's 30 feet between those two buildings, and we have side-by-side buildings. If option B could be bring those two together, put on another floor, and I'm talking about major expansion here, which I think option B should encompass, and now you're up to 9 units. My math was off. across those two goes from 8 to 15 units easily. And probably even more if we dealt with the side setbacks and dropped those off to 10 feet instead of 15. None of that is in here. None of that concept is in the RFP right now, or the ability to do that. I think it's just not there yet because we haven't done the zoning, the initial take of the zoning yet. I think by focusing, including these things in the RFP, it's getting muddied a little bit. And by putting it into a zoning ordinance and just doing the work of taking that items and put it into the zoning ordinance, the first pass, you're going to find, oh, we forgot this, we forgot this, we forgot this. And I think that has to happen before this can go out. And then you take that and you put it into the RFP, and the information is there. If I were a developer and I had no information about, can I merge these? That's a basic question. I'm going to lose all faith in this. And if we get back a bunch of responses that say there wasn't enough information and we decide not to select any of them, and then we go out again, we will have lost the interest of some of these developers, and it may be the best ones.
Again,
So
just
I-
like how,
Right.
just like how Wyatt reminds me not to play transportation and engineer. I'll remind us that we're not developers, which is why we have JLL. And
But-
that's kind of why I want feedback. I'm like, does JLL think that we need more zoning details in the RFP, right? Because essentially we're
I think-
debating like how much detail, how do we make sure we put our best foot
Right.
forward in the RFP?
So
Do we need that
currently-
zoning stuff figured out?
Mayor Hardy?
I'd like his
before you-
response and then.
Before that answer, though, I'm sorry, but before that answer, because I had raised JLL and the pro forma earlier for a reason, okay? JLL is one of the preeminent real estate and development companies in the world, not just this nation. The things that we're asking for here, and I agree with David, informational, I agree with Art, feasibility. You've got an expert already under contract who could provide you with the answers you're looking for. You don't need to go through an RFP process to get those answers. You've got them. So put them to work and have them look at these scenarios and do the performance to determine what the heck you could build here.
I think I heard Matt say
That's all you
that-
need to do.
So
And
first of
then
all,
put out your RFP after you've done your
Lynn,
zoning stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I heard Matt say that that was the plan.
that is in their scope. And I agree with a lot of what you guys are saying. This is a generational decision. We are all taking it extremely seriously. The benefit is not just working with one consultant, but having their benefit at our side, them advising us, so that we can receive other additional creativity, other proposals, and have the best decision that we can make here on this very important site. So rather than just reaching out to one entity, one group, and get their thoughts, which, once those come in, we're gonna have a separate debate of whether or not we trust them. It always happens like that. If we can get additional views and perhaps a pattern or theme starts to emerge, we're gonna feel much more confident about what direction we're moving forward to. The one piece I did wanna come back to, though, is I think your last comment does straggle the sequencing of RFP versus code changes. But I think the scenario you're outlining where potential lots could be combined, that is in the RFP today. So we
I'm
talked
not
about
seeing
that
it.
one scenario.
Yeah, I'm not seeing that at all in there. And as somebody who has written RFPs, who has gotten the responses, even though they're not developers, I do have that experience of how do you respond to an RFP? How do you write an RFP? And I would not send it out with this. If it was something that I were doing, I would not be comfortable sending it out. And if I got it, I would be not comfortable with it. And I think we're on the right path. I think we're close. We're just not there yet. I do have some specifics of here, but I think this whole issue with the zoning versus the RFP, I think we need to have that exercise of saying, what would the zoning look like for those other three that are in between the two on the back? One big concern I have right now is it doesn't have a limit on height for the back. Or so you gave the angle, which, by the way, the change in elevation information, fantastic. I think that needs to be out there much more broadly to say, hey, look, a second floor on these is the first floor in Winter Hill. I think that's a huge thing. that I had not heard before. But it's exactly right there. But it's the other piece that I'm concerned with is when I was knocking door to door in the campaign over the summer, and one of the things that goes on is you're always working on your messaging and what works, what doesn't, which is great. You get to refine it. And one thing that really worked, and then I continued to use it, was one story less. And people were very clear. They don't want to be a Tyson's or a Ballston. There's huge issues with losing our character, that we're becoming a Tyson's, that some people were like, we're already there. And I think part of that is developers will maximize whatever we give them. So if we put in stuff that's to the maximum, they will go to that. If we say 5 to 7 stories, that means 100% 7 stories to them. If you say 3 to 4 stories, 100% 4 stories. That we've seen that over and over again. So if we want to retain that small town feel, that small town character that's in the comp plan, and which, by the way, is not mentioned in the RFP and needs to be, we need to be saying, well, we're not going to go to the maximum. And so with the 45 degrees and the angle, that is important because that shows a great maximum. But we probably shouldn't be doing that. We probably should be backing off a little bit. It's like when you open a faucet and you open it up and you go all the way open. Next thing they tell you is back it off a little bit. 1 story less, a little bit less. I don't think we need to have the buildings 45 feet back from the property line as they are now. 35 feet, sure. And we can figure out how to do it from there. But so there's...
All right, you said you had other specifics. I do want to make sure we use our time well, because I actually do think those specifics are helpful to staff to inform the draft of the RFP.
All right, the other one I want to talk about, the 100 units. If we're looking to see what's possible, I don't think we should be specifying a minimum. If you're saying 120 is where the point is, let them tell us. Let them come to us. And we specify other things. Maybe we're saying 100% affordable, that we want 100% of the units to be affordable. They should tell us what's marketable, what's reasonable. Let them tell us and make it, and the number of units, make it a selection criteria. So you give us more units, you're more likely to get the gig. So that's one. I mentioned the residential design phrasing. I think we need to be much more clear that it's small town residential design. It goes back to small town character in an urban setting, which is straight out of the comp plan. And we need to just be clear, because what we get back will be their starting position for the process. And we don't want to be, we want to have something that really looks and follows our character to start with and work from there. Let's see. The other one that I did not see is the road configuration being on the table. Right now, we have it coming in on one road, on Gibson, and then it's Shirley. We heard from some of the community feedback. I don't remember which one it was. Somebody brought up the concept of at 310 Maple, bringing Shirley through. That actually resonates with me, and I'd like to make sure it's explicitly stated that these things are, that we're open to these, because first, there's an implicit assumption that, we can't change the roads. But if you open that up, all of a sudden the intersection of Gibson and Shirley can be open space and parkland, and it does interesting things. It gives the developers, the respondents, interesting opportunities. I think there's certain inherent assumptions that we need to make sure are in there. Then, all right, that one's fine. Let's see. Minimum units, assumes, I mentioned that scenario B should include the ability to combine lots, so like 312, 310, keep the buildings but combine them into one is a very viable option. We should make it clear that that is on the table. The other thing on heights, we need to just make sure some of the details that when you talk about a height, you're including fences and decks and everything else. It's not just the hard pieces. So I've seen that with some of the T-zones. It's like, okay, it meets the criteria, but then somebody puts a tree on the deck and all of a sudden it's taller, and this is where the maximum runs into problems. And then that was really it. Those were my items.
Do people have other specifics on the RFP? So again, for the sake of using our time well to give staff good feedback. Erin?
So, so I wanted to respond to a few things. I did a lot of what you've heard. Getting back to where Andrea and Bob started on the scenarios A, B, and C, if we zoom really far back, right, or really high out, I do want to acknowledge, right, that we're in a good place because we have 40 units that were not city-committed affordable housing that are committed affordable housing, right? We took 40 units off the market, and they're in our portfolio in a way that we can protect 40 ADUs that we were not previously able to protect 40 ADUs. In my mind, the reason that scenario A, right, is potentially in this RFP is that we don't want to lose those units into disrepair, right? So if you have people come back and they're like, well, scenario C isn't an option for 5 or 10 years until you actually assemble enough to do something, we get the benefit of people who may be interested in rehabbing units, putting a floor on a unit. Like, there are people who are hoping to live in these units, even though, we describe them in such a way that you would think they're on the verge of being condemned, that are living there now and are hoping to stay there. And we need to do something potentially over the next decade in order to make sure that those 40 units stay in a portfolio of habitable ADUs. And so when I look at the scenarios, it's yes, there's the preservation option. I think it's important for it to be there for a fulsome conversation and the sort of feasibility issues and what does the market respond to. But I think it's important to be there just to recognize that there may not be redevelopment, and I think we want this to have the benefit of hearing from those nonprofit providers or those foundations or those whoever else may be out there seeking to keep people in the homes in the communities in which they're currently living in that may otherwise be getting priced out of their actual homes. In terms of scenarios A and B, when I looked at it, I did not quite understand separating no build from additions and bump outs. And I think as we talk about the zoning conversation, in my mind, what could be helpful is if you have scenarios A and B together in terms of these are currently situated quadplexes, they are under this zoning, the zoning allows for this, you could rehab them, and we would be interested in anyone interested in that option explaining it to us and the benefit of it's relative to others. But you could also go up a floor by right? And you do 1.5 times of what's currently there. If Art is correct, and Alan was getting at this too, and I had the question also reading the RFP, if under current zoning, if you are the current owner of those parcels that are now contiguous, and they're under RM, and you could originally come in and put up a 3-story building by right, kind of with the outer perimeter, but removing the inner pieces in terms of all the setbacks that Art was pointing out on that slide. I think if you were to put scenarios A and B together and say, current zoning allows for rehabilitating these as quadplexes, making them into 6plexes, making them into garden-style apartments, it's a way to present that information in a balanced way relative to then what you include as scenario, whatever it is, B, like the redevelopment option that requires zoning changes that isn't necessarily as clear as what might be there, but in the parameters of, and we would entertain creative development that respects these planning concepts that we're telling you are important to us in terms of adjacent uses, buffering, like the setbacks, whatever they are, and that it's divided that way as opposed to sort of like a bunch of options, but when you look at the document, it's so heavily weighted to what is option 4 or option C or option D, that it's like a pretty evident thumb on the scale of what it is we want to get out of this. Like, it feels like A, B, and C are kind of, A and B are currently there. It's like well, they're here because we have to include them here, but like, we really want it to be C, as opposed to A and B potentially being, here's what you could currently do in a much more straightforward process under zoning rules that currently exist, while helping us achieve increased affordable housing than what we currently have there, and helping people remain where they are. And here's sort of like the redevelopment option within the general parameters of what we're willing to entertain. So anyway, that's a potential for consideration, right? In terms of just, you're asking for reactions to the actual document. So that's a reaction to how the scenarios are presented.
No, and I appreciate that. Can you give me an example of where the RFP currently seems to be prioritizing or emphasizing the larger development scenario?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's written in a way that, you know, I don't remember if like all of the information. So what I would imagine is that it would say, Virginia Village consists of like whatever it is, the 20 properties, 10 of them are ones we own. Within our portfolio, we have X, Y, and Z buildings that are currently in this condition that is in the like, here's what we have and what you should understand. Anyone seeking to redevelop this property should both attend, you know, we encourage you to come to the conference, right? And to do the site walkthrough. I don't think that the RFP is currently drafted should be saying like, particularly for people who are seeking to rehab, you should come to the walkthrough. I think anyone who seeks to do anything on this property, whether it's 7 stories or rehabbing a building, should ideally set foot in the property so that they understand more than an image, like what's actually there, right? In terms of, wait, so you said, oh yeah. And so then it kind of goes through like, oh, they're in horrible condition. Like, why would you ever want to try to rehab these buildings at all? And then it gets to scenario C, which is the project is responsive to the goals, objectives, and policies identified in Downtown Small Area Plan, you know, South Washington Small Area Plan, all of these things we want, you would do these things with it. And so like, it very clearly is saying, if you're going to submit an RFP and you want us to tell us why this is preferred, we're very much telling you in an RFP what's preferred, and you would need a really good reason to choose options A or B. I mean, that was like plainly evident when I read the document.
So I think we have, again, the intent behind what you're reading is, I believe it's page 14, depending on the formatting. The mandatory requirements section, I think, provides a consistent introduction to how opportunities on this site could help us reach and achieve some of the goals that we've set for ourselves. Beyond that, the reason why you're seeing some more details on the last option is A, it's not really spelled out anywhere else, and the bulk of the feedback we received from the community was on that scenario. Beyond renovation and walking the site, all we could provide is the status of the current building, because that's what renovation would entail. So I think we try to beef up that section so that balancing it out and not expressing like we have a preference on one scenario versus the other.
But that's why I think like if you were to put scenario A and B and actually tether it to the like current zoning code and make clear whether garden style infill development in the way that we have, I mean, Park Towers is an RM building that was conditional use apparently, probably to get 6 stories. I don't know how it came about. Merrill House is 6 stories. It's an RM building, right? Like it was 3, it got 6 somehow. So people come in under RM and they start at 3 and they seemingly are buildings. They're not limited to quadplexes. And so what I'm just trying to say is like, in terms of feedback, I think it could help if you're trying to send this out, whether it's a request for information or a request for proposal. And I tend to think this is sounding like it may be better going out as a request for information, even though I know why we have been talking about it as a request for proposal in terms of the timing. But that you might just want to tie A and B to the zoning and make clearer whether you can actually like fill in between the quadplexes under the current RM, or if you're stuck with like the quadplexes as they are, apart from going up a floor under the current zoning.
So I guess to make that actionable before we lose that, before you go on to your next one, is that something that we could incorporate in the RFP to confirm whether the current zoning would allow for that kind of horizontal addition?
We can do that, and we can create a fourth scenario or combine one or two. That's definitely, that doesn't take a lot of time. We've been, for this version to come out, we've been playing with very, wide-ranging options
Yeah,
on
and I
how do
just
we
think
group
it,
all
like,
this.
it gets to Art's point of adding clarity, right? Because you're like, A and B, this is what we're potentially trying to do. We're trying to make these better habitable, like, apartments for people. We're maintaining our affordable housing, we're potentially expanding it, and you could possibly do this under the current zoning. And then when you get into option, whatever it is, option C is sort of the, like, redevelopment option that's going to require code changes, and people should be aware that like those are not a given, because we actually haven't had any community conversation about code changes, even though you did a small area plan conversation that will help inform maybe needing to do updates to be able to allow something bigger than what like the RM currently allows. In terms of other specific feedback, I think the massing, I personally think 7's too high, like saying that we would go to 7. I think, looking at buildings like Park Towers and Merrill House, they're at 6. So if you think about putting something with 7, like where the bowling alley is, citing it there, it feels large, and it feels large next to a quadplex that doesn't have any current plan of redeveloping. I know this came up in the Planning Commission conversation. Chair Comont brought it up in terms of what is the relationship of redevelopment to like the quadplexes that things aren't happening with. I agree. I don't understand. Maybe you can help explain why the shadow studies were in the document and then got removed from the document. The 45-degree plane, I think, is helpful. I think it underscores again that would be beneficial for a community conversation, and that you may have things in your mind as to why we're doing things or why it makes sense or why it's 25 and 15 in a document, but like people in the community haven't heard that at all, right? So they react to it in a way that doesn't even have, the aid of any explanation for how you got to that number. And then I think, the other piece in terms of the selection committee and criteria, I'm still sort of uncomfortable with the idea of issuing an RFP, and we haven't had the conversation about like who's on the selection committee. I know there are criteria here, but like how are we standing that up? And from what I could tell of just, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, like best practices is that oftentimes they say like try to stand up a selection committee before you actually issue an RFP, so that you don't run into issues again with the ideas or the notions of, well, this got baked because it went out, and then the selection committee was chosen afterwards, or it went out, and then the zoning was, solidified afterwards, that there are things to do in an order to help bring people along, as opposed to like help, to drive a wedge that we're trying to smooth out, as opposed to continue to kind of deepen. And then, very quickly, I thought it wasn't clear until we were in like the criteria table that, and I think Mr. Krasner brought this up in the Planning Commission meeting about whether this needed to have like commercial uses or retail uses, whether we were entertaining residential only buildings, whether the community spaces had to exist. It isn't until like the table in the criteria where there's that sentence about, you could get points because creative ideas could be making this residential only to help with financing, which would allow you to come down a story. Like there's a sentence about that somewhere, but I think it's buried the same way that, some of what Art was talking about is buried in places, and that it would help to like go through this again and say, what are you trying to communicate? How can we get rid of things that are redundant And how can we, like, make clearer things that may be buried in parts that shouldn't be on page, like, 18 versus page 6? But I mean, I know a lot of work went into it, and I saw you at the community conversations, and I appreciate what planning staff has done, but like, we have to be comfortable with where this is at and whether it's ready to go.
So I don't know whether you noticed, but Justine is with us. Congrats to the new mom. She's been monitoring. First new mom on city council. Justine, do you want us to read you in, or are you just listening?
If I could talk for I can just share my thoughts quickly. I've been listening, but I would love to be able to just jump in for 3 minutes and then head off.
I strongly recommend reading her in.
Okay. Okay. Can you identify your remote location and reason for participation by electronic means, Justine?
I am in Falls Church, Virginia, and I'm participating remotely for medical reasons.
Okay. I move that the City Council approve electronic participation by Councilmember Underhill in this meeting for medical reasons pursuant to the City Council's adopted policy. Is there a second?
Second.
Downs on the second. Agan?
Yes.
Connolly?
Yes.
Downs?
Yes.
Flynn?
Yes.
Snyder?
Yeah.
Hardy, yes. Okay, you're in. Congrats.
Great, thank
and
you.
welcome.
Thank you. I'll quickly, hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I'll just quickly share my thoughts, and then I'm going to have to pop off, and I might have to pop off very suddenly if something happens. But I guess, yeah, just listening to this conversation, I would really like to find a way to be able to, it's almost like this process has been going. We invested in all these Virginia Village properties for a reason. And so I really would like to see this process move forward. And I guess the one thing in my mind is I don't want to restrict ourselves or contain ourselves too much in this process, because I'm really curious, what would come back? And can we, almost not limiting a lot of our options right now, because, maybe there's something that we haven't thought of that actually affordable housing developers done in another part of the country or another part of the state that actually works really well and we haven't even considered. And so, saying it, putting all these parameters on it, I don't want to limit sort of ideas that can come. And just because an idea comes back or a developer comes back and says this is feasible, doesn't mean we have to go forward with it. And so in my head, this is not shutting down the process. I don't want to shut down the process too early, I think is the main thing in my head. And so given that we've been working on this for so long, I would like to find a way that we can move forward and find some way to create meaningful public input as we go on through the RFP process. And so I guess my final point is after having a little girl and thinking about, I want her to be able to live in Falls Church. I want to see more affordable housing in the city. And so how can we do that? And how can we make Falls Church a place where people can come back to live, where kids who graduated from our schools can come back, where people who want to be able to work here can live here. And so I don't want this to take another 18 years before we get there. I would really like to see us do something meaningful and move forward right now. So with that, whatever we can do to be able to keep our options open and to be able to move forward is something that I would like to see. But still, we can still engage the community. We're still representatives of the community. And so I just don't want to cut ourselves off before we even begin this process. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Wish you the best.
Thank you. Bye.
Dana.
Good evening. I was just gonna throw something out there, and it just, the need, because I think Justine talked about the real need that we have for affordable housing. I mean, right now we have 2 ADUs available, and we have a waiting list with over 700 people. We're not taking anybody from priority 3, that's outside. I heard somebody say something about people, I think I heard someone say, who would live there, or would it be people outside of the city? We're not even allowing people that live outside the city to participate right now because we don't have any units. We're only taking 1 and 2, which is, seniors or disabled persons who live or work in the city. So, I mean, it's really critical right now. The people that live over there, we've talked to them. I mean, we have some really low incomes. We have from 0 to over 100%. I mean, it's a really range, but we have people living over there, some who are city employees, that have no income. And so, this is one of the only areas where that affordability is, and I just wanted to throw out that we really have got to do something on the Sooner side, not just the units that we're losing, but like I said, we have 2 units. People are calling every day, and we don't have anything for them. We don't have any more city-committed affordable units. We don't have the budget for that, to have those units. So, I just wanted to throw out there that it's really critical. And we see the people that come in the office all the time, and it's just like, Justine said. I mean, we really have got to do something on the Sooner side.
Thank you for that.
Mayor, may I?
Sorry, Mary Beth was, sorry, you got interrupted earlier, so
Yes,
sorry.
and then I listened to everything, but I really want to make sure I say what is on my mind here. I had sent Mr. Shields earlier this morning a bunch of little cleanups, typos, and other things, but part of I kind of think this RFP is still not quite ready to be issued and voted on next week. And part of it is, as I read through, there just seems to be, some of the wording doesn't actually describe what the community is. Some of the descriptions of what we want are like so vague that, and I know we're relying on developers, I've heard all that tonight, but it still just seems so intentionally vague that it doesn't convey the policy that we are trying. And I agree with Dana, we need to do something. We need to do something. But, and then the other thing that is also challenging to me is I don't think it's a yes or no that people don't want affordable housing or they do want affordable housing, and it's not a black and white, good, bad. There's a lot of nuance here, right? And I think that also has to be reflected in this RFP, and I just don't think we're quite there to be able to do that. So we're on these 2 parallel paths, and maybe we just need to put on the brakes a little bit and think it through as we do the zoning to be able to really get our hands around what this means before we issue the RFP. So that is sort of where I'm coming from right now. And I think, I don't think that means wait a year. And maybe, as we've said earlier, if we wait 2 months, then that does mean waiting a year. But if we take 2 months to really work it through and talk about it in the context of the zoning, then we're going to get better proposals in the end because we will have really fleshed out what we would like the zoning to say. So that is kind of where I am right now.
Are there specific things in this, again, to make it useful for staff,
Yeah.
specific things in the zoning amendments that you think need to be clearer so we can give them direction?
I mean, like one of the things was, it says in there several times, Virginia Village is the city's lone garden-style apartment complex, but it's not. So we have like those little things of fact that are just a little bit off. And it seems like they all need it. Like there are a lot of other garden-style apartment complexes. There's not any that are individually owned like that one. So that kind of little thing, it just needs to be correct as we're putting it out. Like one of the sentences talks about the best thing about starts with the blend of restaurants and highly rated school system is the description of Falls Church. And that's not the description either. I mean, it's important, but our description of what we're looking for and who we are needs to be more than just the blend of restaurants as the first thing. So those are, that's not necessarily zoning, but it does go to what we're looking for in the neighborhood. And then as I think about, I hadn't even thought about putting 2 units together and creating a 3rd or 4th unit there. But what works in that neighborhood are the Winter Hill townhouses. Like they're so successful. People are like, can we put more Winter Hill townhouses on this site and allow the individual owners then to put in townhouses, and I don't know how many would fit. I mean, he showed the size. I don't know how many of those kind of townhouses would fit on that site, but could we do that? To be able to say, we're gonna have some homeownership units, we're gonna have some rental units.
I think that was called out in there, like being able
To
to
be
have
s-
some starter home ownership
Right.
opportunities.
But specifically Winter Hill, like not the T-zone townhouses. We went like the very simple, basic Winter Hill townhouses. That's not in there as a thing, but that's like, I don't know that you can put that in there. But that's what works. We know that works in that neighborhood. We know people want to move into those size of townhouses. I do like the plane. I think that really makes sense to be able to say, you know, we can go up a few stories if we're in or out on the setbacks. So that's where I am. I just think we need to, we're close, but we're not quite there yet for me to be comfortable issuing the RFP.
Can I comment on the starter home piece? We use the term starter homes a lot, and I think we need to maybe take a step down, because one of the problems we have in the city is anytime a starter home comes on the market, it gets snatched up and becomes a big home. We're really talking about the entry point into home ownership, and that could be a garden-style condo, or something. There are other options, and I think we want to be embracing all of those.
Can we narrow it down in the RFP on what sort of
Just the
housing
term,
type?
but to the language of
Yeah,
starter home.
it says, the city is interested in approaches that mix housing within the same building. However, the city will consider a proposal to locate affordable units and market rate units in separate buildings if such an approach supports realistic financing expertise. I mean, I agree. I think it would be nice to have, and this is one of the things I said when I was on the campaign trail, is that we hadn't had condos built in 20 years. And then the ones at the high school, the Oak, were built, and those are very high end. I think the least expensive one, 600. I think they go up to over 400.
I looked.
But up to $1 million. But my point being is that you know, the sort of the no frills home ownership opportunities that don't come with a lot of amenities that tend to jack those prices up, I think would be terrific. And I'll just say, you know, listening to everyone, I just feel, I know that this council supports affordable housing, and Dana's point, like, we need it sooner rather than later. I definitely get that. But I also I am worried about, I would love to see this council be unanimous, you know, behind an RFP, because I think it sends the wrong message if we're not. And I know why, you know, if this were to go to a vote next week, we wouldn't, I don't think. And so it just, to me, that seems unfortunate, because I know we all do support it. But clearly, listening to everyone tonight, that there are, you know, people have different concerns. So I just wonder if we, you know, whether it's another work session. You know, I think I would be fine doing it every, you know, until, you know, we do a work session next week, even if it's an action meeting, we tag on another work session. And Matt, let me just say, or Mr. Matusik, sorry, and Mr. Trainer, you guys have done, I echo the mayor's, her point about, I think you really captured the community feedback. You put it in there. I think it was spot on. I think it's just, you know, obviously you see the council coming at it from different perspectives, which is, it's hard when there's 7 of us, right? So, you know, I'm just wondering, do we I worry that if we're pushing this and we don't have the whole council along, again, it's just, it's going to send the wrong message. And so is it better to take, I don't know what the time frame would be, but take a little bit more time, a couple more work sessions, work through it so that everyone feels good and we get that, you know, to me, the unanimous vote, it is a sign that this is something that and I know we all support that. So I just would hate for it to go down next week or you know, a 3-4 vote or something, because that's just not who we are. I know we all support affordable
Can I
housing.
propose, because one of my biggest concerns is around the zoning and being ahead of it, and I would support bringing this back at the same time as the first reading for the zoning, to say, hey, look, now we can look at them both at the same time, they're in sync, okay, now be more comfortable. My only concern is I will be out for the work session, but I think that sort of time frame, we're just talking about a month. We're not talking push this off a year or whatever. To Justine's point, we want to get this done. We want it, we're all on board on that. just a little bit more. And
Matt wants to
we're spending a bunch of money on the consultants. Let them really attack it.
Fully in line. I think one thing we can do is proceed with our current schedule for the code changes, which would have us visit the Planning Commission, I believe, on June 3rd for a work session where some of that gets socialized a little bit more. We come back, I think it's mid-June, for a work session on the first reading. That gives us another 3 or 4 weeks.
What does that do to the RFP schedule by not issuing it in June?
It does push things out and puts more pressure on the second half of the year. Again, the thinking is once we identify a development partner, they would then have several months to figure out their financing, release their design team to provide a much more detailed proposal that we would then have to review and get all that done before the March tax credit deadline. So again, it wouldn't be the first time aggressive schedules were contemplated like that. But I think what you just highlighted is not unreasonable. I mean, we can try to work with that.
So I actually had 2 questions or comments before everyone's jumped in with their speeches about things, if I could get mine. So along the lines of kind of being curious about the market response, and I think in there we talked about like hybrid options, like if you could do parts of A and parts of B. Could we also ask whether people would join up, and so whether there'd be nonprofit and for-profit entities interested in working together? Is that restricted right now, that it would only be people who seek LIHTC deals?
No, we can go back, but I think there's language in there that opens the door to partnerships and having kind of like sub-developers, if you will. Part of that is the theme of previous conversations and what's already in the RFP does discuss how if portions of the site could go market rate to help subsidize the affordable housing options and thereby reducing our further commitment to the gap financing, that is something that we would entertain and actually support. It's likely that folks that are prioritizing affordable housing are not market rate developers. So in order to pull that concept off, they would have to partner with someone. But we can go back and make sure it's emphasized.
Yeah, but again, given like the uniqueness of the site and how we want to taper to the neighborhood, like it just lends itself to kind of those creative thinking of like, maybe you need to bring in a market rate townhome, starter home developer, right? To work with an affordable housing developer. And I just want to both plant the seed, but also not like completely close the door to different options. So I think it's that balance between being curious about flexibility, but not being too prescriptive. So that was one. Second comment, so having read through, I think, most of the emails, I think the majority, again, to my point earlier, I know that we're debating a lot about sequencing and should this be in our SAP or should this be in the zoning or should this be in the RFP? At the end of the day, I think our job is to reflect the community input. The input comes in 3 areas: setback, heights, and then the concerns about shadows. I think the height and setback you've explained pretty well, and I think I'm pretty comfortable with the explanation and the thoughtfulness that went behind it. I think it would be helpful for council to see examples of what 25 and 15-foot setbacks are. So when this comes back around, either we could go on a walking tour, or you could say, hey, here's an example of a 25-foot setback building with this kind of height. Go walk it or run it yourself and see what it feels like. That would give us a good sense of how it might feel for the community. I think real-life examples are always better than looking at pictures on paper. So that might be helpful to get our heads wrapped around it. The third is, I had heard or read in the comments that people in Winter Hill were like surprised and didn't know. And so I think I want to staff to continue reiterating like the community input that you've done. Especially I think you've gone to several Winter Hill meetings and engaged with that community. So maybe the board hasn't shared with the rest of Winter Hill, but I want to make sure that the community, for anyone who's watching at 10 o'clock at night, hears that actually staff has actually gone to both Tinner Hill, Winter Hill, engaged the residents of Virginia Village multiple times. And so just because people were not aware in Winter Hill does not mean that that engagement has not happened. We're all busy with our regular lives and probably don't have time to pay attention to every city meeting. So I want to make sure that you all got recognition for that, and whatever public comment we got where people said they were surprised by this, it was not because of a lack of effort on your part. So overall, I think given the really substantive discussion on where we are, I think you've heard the feedback. I would prefer that, hearing the sentiment that we all support affordable housing and making progress on this, given that this is 6 years in the making now, to the extent that we can keep the schedule tight. I still think it is good for us to be ambitious because we don't know where the second half of the year where we might erode more time, right? And so I would say give us an aggressive schedule still, incorporating the feedback of how can we bring up some of these zoning questions earlier on or parallel path them, but don't essentially take up so much time that essentially puts next March completely out of the question. Because if we really are serious about meeting our affordable housing goals and building housing before Justine's baby goes to kindergarten, we should get going. So, thank you. Thank you, staff, for joining us and all the work that went into this. Since we're 2.5 hours in, do we want to take a quick break before we move to the next items?
One thing before Jim leaves, there was a Arlington Now article about the mechanical bull. About at the Civic Jam.
That one I don't know.
But I understand there's going to be a mechanical bull. I think Dave, you were quoted too.
New to me. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean,
Well, the good thing was you did not volunteer any of us to ride it, and I was going to volunteer to ride it, but it sounds like now all of a sudden I'm wondering about this news article. So, all right, that was it. Something a little bit more humorous and lighter.
Thank you. So we come back at
Oh.
10:15? Do 5 minutes?
Well, according to the press, it's a done deal.
Resuming, and thank you, David, for joining us at past 10 o'clock. I think the next thing we have is a budget amendment, but before we get to that, Mary Beth wants to read her disclosure.
The City Council is discussing tonight the city's proposed FY 2027 budget. I'm an employee of the Falls Church City School Board, which will be affected by the proposed budget amendment. Because I'm only one employee among many who may realize a reasonably foreseeable direct or indirect benefit from the proposed ordinance, I'm allowed to participate as a council member in this matter under the Conflict of Interest Act. After consideration, I am electing to participate in this transaction because I am confident in my ability to participate fairly, objectively, and in the public interest.
I'll just do a quick introduction. It is common practice that in May of each fiscal year, we ask for a final budget amendment to reflect new grants or new receipts that have come in, but also importantly to move money between departments due to underspending in certain departments and to meet needs elsewhere in the city. And this budget amendment also would deploy the remainder of the council contingency. So, David, thank you for your work on this. I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Shields. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of the council. Tonight, we are presenting this budget amendment, Ordinance TO 26-14, to utilize FY 2026 contingency funds previously appropriated in the FY 2026 budget, transfer appropriation between departments, and appropriate new revenues received during FY 2026. And so for the new revenues, the general fund increase is a total increase of $301,364. And all the details are outlined within the amendment, as well as all of the appropriations listed in here as well. So I'm happy to take any questions from the council.
Thank you, David. Questions or from council?
Maybe we'll just highlight, the council did talk about police fleet during the budget process, and so we are using some of the underspending to provide additional vehicles for the police department. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that, but we're pleased to be able to take this opportunity to do that.
One comment on the police fleet. I was able to attend the police, public community forum on last Thursday, and one of the things that came up was more visibility for the police. So I'd just like to say, probably don't want any more of having one black on black car for the police. We have one for the police, we have one for the sheriff. I think it would be beneficial to not paint our cars all black.
And for those new at this, we'll do another budget amendment for FY '26 in September, October, when we close out the fiscal year.
I had a question, just because this is in here, is Aurora House donations, and maybe, I probably should have submitted it as a council request, and so David, I'm putting this on your radar more than anything else. It's come up several times at our Citizens Advisory Committee meetings that the committee, and I guess staff, is not clear on what donations can come directly to the city, similar to how the Rec and Parks, guide always had you can make a donation to the city language in it. Like, what can come directly to the city for the purpose of, supporting recreational programs for the girls at Aurora House, or summer programming for the girls, that's separate and apart from the scholarship fund, which can't presumably be used for that reason, and isn't as cumbersome as the Friends of Aurora House and Friends of Argus House, 501c3 route that people might otherwise be donating to. And so in this Aurora House donations language, it just again kind of prompted me to ask about that in terms of when can people make donations directly to the city for a specific purpose. And can that be a conversation that we can take up to better understand that? Because it comes up with the different events, and are people able, do they have to make in-kind donations? Can they just make cash donations directly to the city for that purpose, because it's been hard to sometimes figure out the best way to do fundraising, or like where to tell people to go to donate, even if they're trying to actually meet certain needs that we know exist. So separate from this, but I just want to finally get it out there in a way that,
So, Dave, do you have a sort of a concise answer on it? Because I'm going to give a little bit of a vague answer on it, unless you have a better one.
You're good, Mr. Shields, go ahead.
It does come up, and I think it is a little bit confusing. So we might need to write down our policy.
no,
a
that's
little bit more
fine, but
clear.
it's come up enough times in our conversations. And I think, we, on the Citizens Advisory Committee, have said, okay, can staff link up with finance and try to figure out, like, are we able to do this? Can we not do this? Why do we see it in certain places and not in others? Are there thresholds? Are there this, there that? And so I think it would be helpful for just us to understand what we can or can't do, or what the policy is, so that we separately can figure out a path forward and what it should
Yep.
be.
Yep.
Other questions or comments?
Just one, the Founders Row incentives, I think it said that they were not budgeted for in FY '26. That's why we have to do it here. Were they budgeted for in FY '27? I don't remember. if
Yes,
it's in there.
they were budgeted in FY '27, and the reason why they weren't budgeted in FY '26 was, I believe they came online in June of '25. So we didn't have a good baseline determine how much to put into, and I believe the budget was already approved. So we are covered for '27 and onwards.
I had two. One, the insurance reimbursement, which is small, but is that for the mast arms and the light poles that keep getting knocked down? Or are there other things that we're getting insurance on?
One is for the light poles at North Washington and Park. And the second one is reimbursement for water damage at Aurora House.
Okay.
The big Washington and Broad main intersections from those two accidents were already in the budget, in the CIP.
I got asked again by residents on Park Avenue about the poles the 3 or 4 that are succession, right behind the Spectrum, that have been knocked down now for 2 years, longer? Longer.
Yeah.
We just have orange cones on them. And I know that ideal placement would not have them so close to the street, and the ideal would be, per new street safe standards, we'd have them closer in and anyway, it's not. But is there plans to replace them at any point? Do we get insurance money for them?
Public Works has been looking at alternative solutions, because it's those, plus there's one at the corner of the library going into the parking lot drive aisle that gets knocked down too. So they're actually looking at a solution that can provide lighting and not have the constant knockdown, because it's just the trucks parked too close and they take them down every time. So using the insurance proceeds without a good solution was not prudent, so it's still on hold.
And then while we're on lights, I actually got an email over the weekend about the street lights on Broad. So I know that we had issues with wiring kind of in the 1,000 block or so, further up, closest to the west end. But now the ones in the downtown are dim or off altogether. Like in front of Mr. Brown's Park, like that whole the 200 block of Broad Street are all out. It just made me think of streetlights while we're all talking about it. So I don't know whether it's the same signal wiring issues,
I have to check.
but
for
that block
200
being dark is unusual, because normally it's very brightly lit. That's where we probably have a lot more pedestrians at night too. And then the HR issue for 30,000, is that, and we don't need to be briefed on the details of the HR issue, but is that a normal or atypical thing that we have since it needed budget amendment? It was under the city attorney.
What line number is that? I'm sorry.
147.
Right. So this is in working with kind of our new policy whereby when there is a complaint about an employee, that we have a process of bringing in an outside entity to look at that complaint, just to gather all the facts. And so we are doing that, and there are costs associated with that. So with working with the city attorney's office, kind of depending on what the nature of the complaint is, there are times when it is beneficial to have the investigation done by an attorney as opposed to by a non-attorney for just a good risk assessment of the complaint. And so that's what that budget amount is for.
Okay, well, I'm glad, I think that was a improvement and process change we had made, so it sounds like it's in place, so.
That's right.
Okay. Any other questions or comments on the budget amendment? Okay, I think we're good. Thanks, David.
All right, thank you, council.
Poor David, we should let you go first.
He wanted to go first.
Well, I'm going first with budget, so.
Yeah, right.
Alrighty, have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Consent?
And so the big one on consent that we wanted to just, so Jenny is here to answer any questions on it, but we're excited to be moving forward with a contract with the firm of ESI to assist the city in considering the future of our enterprise resource planning process. And so Jenny was going to give a briefing for the council on that contract and what we hope to accomplish with it.
So I do have a couple of slides that speak to this particular contract. This is a contract to amend our existing contract with Enterprise Solutions Incorporated, also known as ESI. And so we are utilizing consulting services to bring expertise. They have specific knowledge around the RFP process, and also specific expertise around our enterprise resource planning system, also known as our city financial systems. That's how that's the term I used when I presented on April 13th. And so they have specific knowledge about those two things, along with vendor knowledge and a library of requirements of an enterprise resource planning system. We're looking at a consultant because it would also accelerate our timeline. Also within the staff report, we did build in buffers for time and cost. So I think the total is for $293. And for the specific for the specific RFP part, it would be roughly $235,000. So the next slide is just a refresher from the April 13th of the 3 to 5 year time plan. The city financial system is in that first block on the lower section. So it's basically taking that section is what we're talking about right now. And in the next slide, Taya, breaking that out into our timeline. So looking at, and you can also see this in the table that's on page 2, looking at starting the process now, and then it would continue through June of next year, ideally. Within the staff report, we did talk about FY26 through FY28, so building in that buffer, as I spoke to earlier, when it comes to the timeline. So the first section would be the procurement plan development. The next phase is developing the procurement package, and those are 2 separate phases. And along with developing the procurement package, we would also look to finalize any of the requirements. We've made quite a bit of progress with that in doing the assessment of the system, which I think I spoke to on April 13th as well. Then in August through November, we would do the solicitation and issuance of the RFP, and then finally move into evaluation and review, and ultimately working on the contract itself, both in negotiation and then finally awarding the contract. In the next slide, this is exactly what's in your staff report. That is the table of each of the tasks along with the cost and the hours. These are estimated costs and hours. And so ideally, the total right there is $232,875 for the cost. However, since this is an estimated cost, what was in the staff report was an amount of $235,000, which was also highlighted in the budget amendment as well. So $100,000 coming from the general fund with the budget amendment, and then the remainder of the 135 would come from underspending that is currently in the IT budget, and it would just be utilized for professional services instead of the 2 positions that were allotted for within the IT budget. And then the final slide is, this was a slide that I had in the presentation from April 13th, so this is overall in terms of costs for meeting that vision of the enterprise resource planning system or the city financial system. And so we would be in FY27. It does state that the $150,000 is unfunded. However, with the budget amendment and with the staff report, I think we would be funding the whole amount, and so we would not be coming back in FY27 for additional funds. We would complete the RFP process with what we have both in underspending and with the underspending through the general fund. And with that, if you have any questions.
I guess the part that where the lead is kind of buried is the $2 million costs that are unfunded in the next 2 years after that.
Yes.
So it's good that we can hopefully get a budget amendment to take care of this now, but I know that we're outside of budget season, but that's what we're staring at, I think, in
Yes.
FY 28 and 29.
Yes.
Okay, questions or comments for staff? Dave?
So could you review again for the public's benefit, what is this project?
So the city financial system is the underpinning or the foundation for all of the city business processes. And so the things that have been most visible, I think, to the public and to council, and that council has been most concerned with, are the permits process and the payments process. And so in order to achieve the vision and the goals that we'd like to have with our permits and our payments process, part of that is really looking at our enterprise resource planning system, also known as the city financial system, and also making some changes to that system. We know that changes need to be made to that system, and utilizing the RFP process, I think, will not only provide us additional information from vendors, it will also give us a best product for what we're looking for to solve some of those issues with our permitting system and our payments system. So the I think a council member used this, I'm always reluctant to use this word, the unsexy side of our city financial planning system is all that foundational stuff. Our data, our internal processes, and that's the behind the scenes, the 90% of the iceberg that you all don't see. So the fun part or the sexy side of the city financial system are things like the permitting system and the payment system, where we're looking to have a portal where people can easily access their information, that it's very transparent. And so in order to get there, our assessment right now is that we need to go through this process and really look at everything and get a better product. And that's not just my opinion, that has been the assessment from consultants and also of other staff who interact with the system as well.
So the parallel that given that we just talked RFP for 2.5 hours, this is the little RFP to bring in ESI, and then eventually we will have a big RFP for the $2 million future Munis.
Yes.
Okay, so that helps.
Little RFP, big RFP.
And we have strategically chosen not to fund some of our FTEs that the council has approved so that we can have this money for contractual support, so we can bring in some outside expertise to help us through that process.
So can I just continue, just to finish that train of thought? So just like how we don't have real estate experience and wanted JLL to help us in the little RFP.
Correct.
We don't feel like we have in-house experience to kind of vet what the right IT tool and platform is, and that's why we need ESI for $100,000?
I would say the right expertise. Some of us may have experience in different vendors or different technology. I think this particular an enterprise resource planning system is large enough and needs specific expertise, and that's what we're contracting with ESI for.
Now,
I don't want to downplay anybody's experience that they've had, because I know David's had experience with different planning systems. I know that other of our IT staff have. So I don't want to downplay that experience. I think the expertise and the depth of expertise that we're looking for is really with a consultant.
So I'm trying to get to my point. I do have a point.
Sure.
So just like
Sorry.
how we don't know enough about real estate and we want to bring in someone with an expert to help us navigate the process, I hear you and not having the expertise here. In terms of the outcome we want, though, knowing that the enterprise, the ERP world has started consolidating, majority of people seem to use Tyler or an add-on to Tyler, which is what is the company behind Munis. Do we think that going through an extensive RFP, we're essentially going to end up with Tyler again, but just a more modern version? And therefore, do we really need a $100,000 consultant to get us that answer?
I believe that we do. We could, so I think in the assessment that I've done and the conversations that I have, I don't know that most people use one vendor. I think there are certainly organizations that utilize multiple vendors and do like a best in class of different, Tyler calls them modules, but of different functions. So they may get a permitting function through one vendor and their payments through another vendor, and then their financial system through another vendor. There are also organizations who contract with a vendor who will build it the way that an organization wants it to look like. So that's SAP. Am I saying that right, David? So a company like SAP. Tyler has, I think, made a lot of changes since we invested with them, I think, over 20 years ago, 2002, 3? And so I think going through this process and competing it's time to do that. And I think also having the consultant assistant is essential to that, to get a good product, whether it's staying with Tyler and having a much more robust contract, or if we do discover that there's something out there that better suits our needs.
Do we have a good view of what the landscape is, like who all our neighboring jurisdictions use, or what combinations of tools they use? Because if we find that 75% actually uses Tyler, are we really going to go through an RFP process, end up at the same place with just some updated modules? Like, would the money be better spent on the upgrades and not an RFP process that get us essentially that same answer?
I don't know that that's any different than what I just said. I don't know that my answer would be any different than what I just said.
I think one of the factors we have to keep in mind, and why I think we do need a consultant on this, is that enterprise software is rife with change right now. I mean, this is an area that AI is just transforming. It's not an evolutionary change. There's a transformative change going on right now, and Tyler might be best right now, but a year from now, they may be the one holding back. Even something as, well, I was going to say simple, but boy, would that have been wrong. The data migration piece that we're going to have to deal with is just, it's scary. And yet that's an area that AI it's transforming it. It's like so different. So, I mean, I don't know, I think enterprise software overall is in this is in an incredible place right now, and if you're gonna change, it's scary to try and keep up with it, so we need help.
And I guess, I think what I would add to, you know, it's not just a simple matter of buying another module or getting a new module. It's really looking at our whole entire system and is it serving, whether we're with Tyler or not, whether it's serving our needs and if it's functioning well. And so I think having the consultant, they've gotten us this far. I think having that consultant input and their expertise about what they're seeing out, you know, in the world of enterprise resource planning systems is important. I don't think we can just go out and buy more modules and it's going to solve the problem. I think having this expertise to guide us through the process and having the feedback from vendors to then evaluate. And I don't know if we'll land on Tyler again or if there's something better out there. I have certainly seen other vendors where I'm like, okay, there are some things that I think we would want to consider.
So I guess before it comes back next week, I was just asked to know kind of what everyone uses, just to know what the landscape is.
So Fairfax uses SAP. City of Fairfax uses Tyler. And I would have to look up Alexandria and maybe Loudon.
Or Arlington and Fairfax
Arlington.
City. Or, you know. We don't need
Yeah,
to
I
answer
think-
now, but just before, I think it'd be helpful to know what the landscape looks like.
I think the bigger organizations use those bigger companies they build it for them. So Oracle, SAP. And then as you get smaller in size, I think it's a combination between probably Tyler, I think it's OpenGov, and then doing best in class and picking, you know, Tyler does potentially their financial piece, and then other vendors use, you know, another company to do payments and permits. But I can get.
Mary Beth was next before I jumped in.
I just want to make sure, I think the schools use Tyler as well.
Yes.
Are they part of this
Absolutely.
process?
Yes.
Okay, and then Tom Clinton is here, the Commissioner's Office and the Treasurer's Office. They're all involved in the process. Okay.
Yes.
Because it does touch every single office, the assessor, and there's a lot of people involved in that. Thanks.
Dave?
Does this include cybersecurity?
So the enterprise resource planning system does not include cybersecurity. I mean,
Cyber's on everything.
I was going to say cybersecurity is on everything. If you're speaking to,
Is part of this contract reviewing, protecting the data that's used in our financial systems? Like, if we collect a lot of personal information on people when they pay their various bills, is that included in this?
I think it would be.
Could it be? I don't know.
I think it's
I'd
part of
feel-
any enterprise resource planning system. I think what you may be referring to is when we had talked during budget season was our CISO, so our Cyber Information Security Officer, and that we are contracting out, and that's currently being looked at under another RFP process.
Yeah, Cindy, could you?
Yeah, I was just going to add, in working with purchasing, every contract that we do issue out has terms and conditions for the cybersecurity and the control of the data, and whether it's housed on the cloud or on-prem, to make sure that that PII is protected. And so I have no doubt that'll be part of the assessment as well as a future RFP. And then parallel to that, your next consent agenda, we obviously carry cybersecurity insurance as an overlay to the
And-
vendor's responsibility.
Okay, because it really needs to cut across all areas with a special focus, though, on where we're collecting personal information.
That is true, and also with all our other vendors that interface, because we have, Rexham Park rec tracks, and you've got personal information there that then feeds into Munis. So it's a holistic focus for sure.
And law enforcement and we collect a surprising amount of personal information.
We sure do, and
So
enterprise transformation, as Mr.
Yeah.
Hagan said, the AI is definitely adding to cybersecurity.
Okay, and just piggybacking on what Art said a minute ago, this is all moving very quickly. I deal with some of these issues on my day job, so are we looking at where AI can improve our system as well as avoiding the obvious vulnerabilities that AI is bringing with it? Is that part of what we're looking at?
I think when it comes to vendors, if the vendors are using AI, so whether it's with data migration or implementation, that becomes part of the package that they would present to us. Are we independently using AI? No, not at this point. We're not implementing our own, I always want to call it a multi-level marketing plan, but it's a
Large language model.
LLM, not an MLM.
language, LML, yeah. The
Which
language
is
model.
just one part of it. I guess the fundamental question is ESI bringing, as part of this contract, cyber and AI expertise to help us evaluate the cybersecurity, the AI flexibility, all these different things that are constantly changing. And to the extent of the best way you protect customers' data is you don't actually have it in your systems. And there's other ways. Having gone through a credit card migration, scary.
And just today, I was speaking with the purchasing team as I'm working on another RFP, and there's a lot of stuff that you're building. We're now building into the RFP to ask, are they using it, disclose it, how are you using it, how are you protecting it, are you using our data to train on? So there's a whole suite of questions that are going into the regular RFP process that we're now going to implement, in addition to your point of what does this vendor do to help us assess those points. That part I'll defer to them.
Okay, other questions or comments? Okay, thank you, Jenny. And then the other half of consent is the Versa. Do you have anything to note, or just?
That's generally kind of an annual thing, and I don't think there's anything too new about that.
Glad to answer questions. There were some mid-year amendments where we enhanced some land use, claim coverage, and fiduciary oversight insurance for retirement board trustees as well as staff implementing the programs.
Okay. People have questions or comments on that one? Okay. I think that's it for work session. It's 11, so I'm not sure we want to really do council schedule.
We should probably wait to, because now we have to rethink the RFP.
Well, I was going to suggest
so
maybe
how to
on
fit that
Wednesday,
into the
Wyatt, if you
schedule.
have a revised schedule based on the zoning timeline that Matt laid out when, I think Laura had a good idea of like, maybe we just use next week to continue the discussion. Like especially if we're not, I think it'd be nice if staff can, kind of like a comment matrix like we normally do for other things. To say, here's everything we heard, here's where it's either reflected or not reflected, here are changes we're making. At least then it's a good like recap
track
of
it.
2 hours of discussion.
Right.
And then there may be more, or we may feel pretty good, and then we're like, here's the schedule then if we feel pretty good.
And the benefit of doing that is I hate to push, because it's still fresh in everyone's minds too. Like that's, I don't want to lose the momentum.
Right.
So, yeah.
So based on that input, on Wednesday, if you could show us a schedule of like, okay, we'll do another tag on work session on Monday night on the RFP and the initiating, I guess the question is, are we comfortable initiating the resolution for the zoning changes? Because that just lets staff start the work, right? So that still can stay on the schedule. The only thing people have discomfort with is releasing the RFP. And so if we have a second work session on the RFP then, based on all the feedback we heard, a good like recap of what we heard, what staff's doing about it, and then we talk about a revised timeline then.
Yeah, we'll have a schedule for trying to work the RFP to get it to, like, what's a good process for us to get to the point where there is consensus that we've got it in the right spot. So we want to give a little bit more thought about that. One idea was to target first reading for the zoning, have that be the target to have the RFP in a good shape to release, but let us think that schedule through a little bit more. The other task is how to engage effectively with key people to make sure that, we're kind of working the issues. But we'll have a good plan.
Okay, I guess we'll come back Wednesday then. Is there anything else for tonight?
Maybe just one last thing so the selection committee itself, and I don't mean to open up a big can of worms here. With the West Falls project, the selection committee was a city manager appointed group. And that was at the recommendation of the procurement team. They're like, procurements are they are kind of confidential administrative functions. Now, they just give an advice, ultimately the city council makes the decision on it. So that's what I'm proposing, is that the selection committee would be, the city manager would organize it with the representation that Matt showed on the slide. Is the council okay with that, or do we need to talk a little bit more about that?
So to clarify, because during discussion, there was some concern that the selection committee is choosing the winning proposal. Ultimately, that still vests with us.
That's right. The
I'm not sure people heard that.
There's closed sessions where if it's proprietary information held within those proposals, council sits in on, hears from the selection committee, this is why we picked B, these are the other options, and then we get to go over and talk about it all and decide if we agree with B or we want A.
So we're not outsourcing that decision to the selection committee.
No.
I'm not sure people heard that.
For West Falls, there was a thing that procurement people hated it, but we forced them to do it, which was that there was a public meeting where the two kind of finalists gave presentations, so the public could see that.
I vaguely remember that. We were in the community center?
Right. And so I'm curious about doing something like that to make it a bit more transparent. But an RFP process is sort of structurally under Virginia law is generally not a super open process.
And I wasn't under a misimpression that they choose the partner. Like, I understand that they whittle down submissions, and then they
And
say,
matrix them and analyze them, and so here's
what we
why.
thought makes sense, and here's who we have chosen as the selection committee to put before you as the council, as the partner we would recommend.
And the council can look at all of them and can do a de novo review, but you would have this group with broader representation do that work for the council, and then
Yeah. My point was the timing, that I had understood, and oftentimes it makes sense to set up selection committees, set up hiring panels, set up what that looks like before you're actually receiving submissions in your hand,
Yeah,
and then
and-
assigning the people to things you've already been able to look at.
I think there's merit in that, having that laid out well in advance too. So we're going to get cracking on that, and I think as part of the schedule, we'll lay that out as well.
How do people feel about being a city manager appointed selection committee with obviously us being the final decider?
What's the selection committee gonna do again?
So they will.
Is it analytical?
Yeah, they will take the proposals, they will review them, they'll score them, and then they'll share their scoring with the city council.
Okay. So the selection committee is not making a selection. What they're doing is they're analyzing the.
Now, they typically would make a recommendation. So here's their analysis, and we're recommending, based on that analysis, this group. And they don't, I mean, to me, that's valuable to have them sort of go ahead and give a recommendation. They could say, we recommend these 2 finalists, you all make the final decision. They could do something like that.
Is there part of the process, I know there's a part of the process where the vendors come back with questions for us and we respond. After they send their proposal in, is there a Q&A session with the selection committee so that any of these gaps and so forth get filled in before they come to council? Do they
So
handle
my
that stuff?
experience, a selection committee can meet with as many of them as they want to, and so if you get 15 proposals, you might not meet with all 15, but you would meet with perhaps 5 of them, and they would give you a big dog and pony show, as well as what's on paper.
Yeah, and that also enables us to have, community feedback, because you've got boards and commissions on there, which the mayor, I was whispering to her, do we need to have a community member on this? But there will be community members, because those are our
Boards and
board and
commission
commissions.
members are
Right,
community members.
right. So that way, that also enables us to say we did take in, we did have representatives from the community on as part of this process.
And then are you going, so then how does that work with boards and commissions? Do you say to, planning commission, can you choose who you would want to put onto this
And
committee, or
West-
you do reach out and say, ex-planning commissioner, would you like to be
It's a
on the
good,
selection
very
committee?
good question. So with West Falls, we had been doing the thing that you proposed, which is that selection committee had actually been meeting for a while already, even before the RFP was issued. So it was sort of a group. And so it continued on for the selection process. How they got picked, I think probably like the planning commission said,
think the
they
body
sent 2
picked-
people.
Yeah.
So that's what, bottom line is, if council's comfortable with that approach, I would send a note out to the planning commission, the EDA, and the housing commission, and ask them to provide their person they'd like to be on the selection committee.
Are we going to have a representative from Winter Hill? The reason why I'm being specific about that is, unlike the school project where we really weren't developing or thinking about developing in some way something right at a neighborhood, but I think it is really helpful if in this case you had someone.
So I'm recommending not doing that.
Yeah, this is the issue
Yeah.
that I have with the selection committee.
Yeah.
So we were making the final call, and out of the 198 units in Winter Hill, there's the handful that abut it, and obviously they're the most impacted, right? And so I want to make sure we keep that broader context in mind. Is
Yeah.
that
Fine, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, and I think there's going to be people that are probably just as far as some of the people in Winter Hill that aren't going to be part of, represented, right?
Well, if the council does, I want this group is serving the city council. I'm kind of administering it. And so I would like it to be done, the council's like, I like the way that this is set up. So,
Like, for example, the residents at West Broad arguably are just as close as some of the farthest neighbors in Winter Hill, but we're not saying, hey, you should have a representative on this, right?
I think
Well,
it'd be better.
the issue is, though, this is a fairly unique project, that you really, it's dropping it right in an area that I think needs to have some kind of representation on this. Unless the selection committee is literally gonna do an objective matrix, here's what it is, kind of an analysis.
I think it would be
Off the right.
beneficial.
That's why we're
if-
laying out
that's
the-
what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, I think it would be beneficial is if there's somebody who's on one of the current boards and commissions who does live in Winter Hill, that I think would be beneficial if we looked at that to see if there was somebody like that, because what concerns me is that we have some people from Winter Hill with very strong opinions that are not necessarily going to be putting the city as a whole. I don't want to see the selection committee just becoming a giant fight behind the scenes. And it would be worse if it's like, and nobody listened to me and everybody just ignored me. So need to be a little careful with that.
But along the same lines, I mean, are you going to have a resident of Virginia Village on the selection committee. Arguably, they're even more affected than Winter Hill is.
Yeah.
So,
Kind of one other challenge with those is like who, and like who picks that person. And so maybe we'll think about that a little bit more, but when we do get together on the 26th, I'll flesh this out a little bit more and get some more reaction to it. But it's an important group, and it needs to be operating with the full support of the
To
city
Dave's
council.
concern, though, I think that's why we're laying out that criteria with the scoring. Like, they
Yeah.
are supposed to be very objective. We're laying out the criteria of how you're going to be evaluated. Here's how you get awarded points. They are bringing a lens of being a planning commissioner, an EDA person, and a housing person. But other than that, like, we're telling them, here's how people should get scored. So I feel pretty comfortable if we are the ones making that call and asking 5 people to make that decision.
I
Or do
think
that initial homework for us.
I think it would be beneficial if we had them identified in at least first meeting of them before we issue the RFP, so that they, as the selection committee, can chime in on the RFP and make sure there isn't something they're like, oh, wait a minute, how are we going to grade it if it doesn't have this?
Yeah. That's right. I mean, that could be one other function of the selection committee, is that the council could ask that selection committee to do the final scrub of the RFP to make, you don't want to outsource that? Okay.
Did we adjourn 10 minutes ago?
We did.
We had final discussion.
So I did open up a can of worms, but we'll have some more information.
I just have one thing that is a council request more than anything else. So, when I asked about Greenway Downs and when this would be done, usually it would be done in May, and it's mostly done. Many intersections have been spotted, and they look good. But my question is, are the stop signs going to be moved? Are they removed?
Oh, yeah, that'll be.
Is that the final part?
No, it was the
Yeah.
speed bumps are the final part.
Speed humps are fun.
True. Yes, you're right, so they won't be done.
The extensions are great.
Extensions, but some of
Yeah.
the stop signs are still in their original spot.
Yeah, they'll get moved.
Oh,
They get
another
moved with new
thing,
stop bars and everything, I think.
I'm sure you saw, it went to everyone, Kathleen's response to the budget and finance calendar for June
Yeah.
26th.
It's
And
on.
so I will touch base, I guess, with Wyatt and David to get kind of a reaction as to, it's on for the 26th, but Kathleen had responded about how do we have that conversation? Does it need to be phased, staged? Like, how are we doing that? So it will make sense for me to touch base with you and David, other people, if you have thoughts, get in contact with me, let me know. I'll touch base with Art and Laura. I guess I can't do that individually, but we'll figure it out in terms of, let me know what you think, but we'll talk.
It's fine for you to talk.
Yeah, but it's more about, like, they were saying, the process and having the whole school board doesn't need to be a joint meeting that's not a budget and finance meeting, but it really seems like it's a beginning conversation, time dedicated to revenue sharing, getting the benefit of sort of your institutional knowledge about some of this and how we've approached things certain ways or why we've approached things certain ways, or open questions that still exist, kind of doing a debrief coming out of the budget cycle and
Yeah,
then
it's not gonna
what
be a
comes
one-
into.
one
No, it
meeting.
won't be, but it needs to be part of that meeting, and then we need to figure out next steps from it.
Most
so.
of us,
Ring in Kieran Bawa and Kristen Michael is what we need to do.
So anyway, I just, so if you have thoughts,
yes, I
let me
guess
know.
just a quick thought
and
is
we
that I presume, based on the fact that we all brought it up during budget, is that we, as a council, we prefer budget and finance taking a first crack at it, knowing that we're going to have more discussions. And majority of us show up to budget and finance anyway, so it's not like we feel like we're not represented, but that's my point of
It's
view.
not like the school board is limited to that chair and
People can
vice
show up if
chair.
they want
can
to.
show up and be part of the initial conversation, and then we'll have plenty of follow-up conversations. We're going to need to work through this going into any budget guidance, obviously, so, yeah, okay.
I don't feel the need to immediately plan a massive joint meeting if we have it on the calendar, and people are welcome to join that one.
And I'm planning to do a sit-down, and maybe a couple sit-downs with Terry Dade and Alicia Prince before the Budget and Finance to see if we can come to some shared views on things that we could share with the committee.
Be helpful if there was a staff recommendation coming into it.
So
Thanks.
one last quick thing, if you can keep us in the
with so many
loop,
last
if you
things.
hear anything about the NextEra Dominion Energy merger. Obviously.
It's been all over the news today.
All over the news, and
If
Dominion Energy and another
I
big
talked to him today if you want. So.
NextEra Energy are merging. It's gonna take 18 months, but big deal, and we use Dominion, so.
Yeah, I had a quick conversation with Dominion today, and everything local will still say Dominion Energy. We'll have our same staff, we'll have the same trucks, but it will be a big merger, still has to have approval, so 12 to 18 months. So the initial intent is operations will look and feel the same, how it impacts rates and all that to be unfolding.
We're not gonna get anything for 12 months.
Nope, 12 to
Yeah.
18 months.
And then, who knows? That's.
I'm signed up. Okay, I think we're
But
adjourned
we're
now.
tracking
Thank
it,
you all.
Mr. Egan.